Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The haunting midnight delivery. A truck driver's encounter with something not of this world, from Jake. The call came through dispatch at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, just as I was settling into my sleeper berth at a truck stop outside Bakersfield. Emergency delivery, they said. Medical supplies needed at a research facility in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Coordinates provided via GPS since the location wasn't on any standard map. Double overtime pay for the inconvenience of a midnight run, plus a substantial bonus for discretion and speed. I'd been driving for Apex Medical Transport for 6 years, specializing in time-sensitive pharmaceutical deliveries that required careful handling and absolute reliability. The company had built its reputation on getting critical medications to remote locations where traditional shipping couldn't reach, and I'd made dozens of emergency runs to research stations, military installations, and isolated medical facilities across the western states. But this delivery felt different from the moment I pulled up to the loading dock at the Bakersfield facility. The cargo was already waiting, secured in a climate-controlled container about the size of a refrigerator, marked only with biohazard symbols and handling instructions that filled 3 pages of dense technical language. The loading crew worked in complete silence, their faces hidden behind full respirator masks that seemed excessive for standard medical supplies. The shipping manifest listed the contents as experimental therapeutic compounds, with a destination listed as Sierra Research Collective Facility SEP. No street address, no town name, just GPS coordinates that pointed to a location deep in the mountains where no roads should exist according to my atlas. The route took me northeast from Bakersfield on Highway 58, then north on increasingly narrow mountain roads that seemed to wind higher and deeper into terrain that felt untouched by civilization. My headlights carved through darkness so complete it seemed solid, revealing twisted pine trees and granite outcroppings that created an almost alien landscape in the limited visibility. It was past 1 a.m. when I first noticed the lights following me, not headlights from another vehicle, but something else entirely. Soft blue-white illumination that seemed to drift through the trees parallel to the road, keeping pace with my truck but never coming close enough for me to see their source clearly. At first I assumed they were some kind of emergency or construction lighting, maybe Forest Service equipment working on fire prevention during the cool night hours. But the lights moved too smoothly, too purposefully, flowing through terrain that would be impossible for vehicles or heavy equipment to navigate. They maintained perfect distance from my truck, accelerating when I accelerated, slowing when road conditions forced me to reduce speed, as if they were escorting me toward my destination rather than simply sharing the same general direction. My CB radio had been silent since leaving the valley, showing no signal strength in the mountainous terrain, but around 2 a.m., it suddenly crackled to life with a transmission that made my blood run cold. Delivery vehicle approaching Facility 7, you are expected. Maintain current route and speed. Do not deviate from provided coordinates. Do not attempt to establish contact with escort units. Arrival time estimated at 0247 hours. The voice was human but strangely modulated, as if it were being electronically altered or filtered through equipment that distorted natural speech patterns. More unsettling was the fact that whoever was transmitting knew exactly where I was, what I was carrying, and when I would arrive at a destination I'd never heard of before tonight. "This is Apex Medical Transport," I responded. "Please identify yourself and confirm delivery authorization." The response came immediately. "Identity confirmation unnecessary. Authorization derives from protocols beyond your clearance level. Continue to destination. Deviation will result in intervention by escort units." Escort units. The blue-white lights that had been following me through the mountains weren't random phenomena or construction equipment. They were some kind of security system, monitoring my progress and ensuring I reached the designated delivery point without deviation or delay. I tried calling my dispatcher, but my phone showed no signal in the remote mountain location. The CB radio remained active only for the mysterious transmissions directing my route, falling back to static whenever I attempted to contact other drivers or emergency services. The road continued to climb through terrain that seemed increasingly unnatural. The trees were too uniform in size and spacing, the rock formations too precisely carved, the road surface too perfectly maintained for a route that didn't appear on any map. It felt like driving through a constructed environment rather than natural wilderness, as if the entire landscape had been artificially created for purposes I couldn't understand. At exactly 2:47 a.m., as predicted by the mysterious radio voice, I reached the coordinates specified in my delivery instructions. What I found was a facility that defied easy description, a collection of low angular buildings that seemed to emerge from the mountainside itself, constructed from materials that reflected my headlights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The buildings were surrounded by the source of the blue-white lights that had escorted me through the mountains, tall posts topped with illumination devices that cast an ethereal glow over the entire complex. The light wasn't harsh like normal security lighting, but soft and diffuse, creating an atmosphere that felt more like moonlight than artificial illumination. Personnel emerged from the facility as I backed up to what appeared to be a loading dock, though the architecture was unlike any warehouse or medical facility I'd ever seen. They wore full containment suits that covered their entire bodies, moving with precise coordination that suggested extensive training in handling dangerous materials. The unloading process was completed in absolute silence. No verbal communication, no paperwork exchange, no confirmation signatures. The climate-controlled container was removed from my trailer and disappeared into the facility through doors that sealed behind it with a hiss of pressurizing air. One of the suited figures approached my cab and handed me an envelope containing cash payment for the delivery, significantly more than the amount specified in my original contract. Attached to the payment was a single sheet of paper with a brief message printed in block letters. Delivery completed successfully. Return via same route. Maintain speed and direction. Do not stop. Do not deviate. Escort will ensure safe passage to Highway 58. I wanted to ask questions about the facility, the cargo, the unusual security measures, but the suited figure had already turned away and was walking back toward the buildings. The blue-white lights began to dim, and I realized that my welcome was over. The return journey was even stranger than the delivery run. The escort lights reappeared as I left the facility, but now they seemed more urgent, more insistent about maintaining speed and direction. When fatigue made me consider pulling over for a brief rest, the lights would intensify and move closer to the road, as if warning me that stopping wasn't permitted. My CB radio remained active with periodic updates about my progress, always in that same electronically modulated voice that provided navigation instructions and estimated arrival times with impossible precision. Delivery vehicle departing Facility 7. Progress nominal. Estimated arrival at Highway 58 Junction, 0421 hours. Maintain current speed. Escort will disengage at designated point. The lights stayed with me until I reached the junction with Highway 58, where they suddenly vanished as if they had never existed. My CB radio fell silent, returning to normal static, and my phone regained signal strength as I descended from the mountains toward more populated areas. By dawn I was back at the Bakersfield truck stop where the night had begun, but the experience felt like it had lasted much longer than the few hours indicated by my logbook. The cash payment was real. The delivery receipt was properly filled out, and my truck showed all the normal signs of a mountain drive. Road dust, slightly elevated engine temperature from the climb, normal wear on brakes and transmission, but when I tried to research Sierra Research Collective or Facility 7, I found no information anywhere, no government contracts, no medical research publications, no facility licensing records. The GPS coordinates I'd followed led to an area that satellite imagery showed as empty wilderness with no structures or roads visible. I called my dispatcher to confirm that the delivery had been completed successfully, but she had no record of the emergency run. According to company records, I'd been off duty all night, parked at the Bakersfield truck stop for my mandatory rest period. The only evidence that the delivery had actually occurred was the cash payment, which I deposited without reporting to the company, since there was no official record of the job. But I kept the receipt and the instruction sheet, physical proof that I'd transported something to somewhere that officially didn't exist. I've made dozens of legitimate emergency deliveries since that night, but none have involved escort lights, mysterious radio transmissions, or facilities that can't be found on any map. The experience exists in my memory like a vivid dream that feels more real than my normal waking life, but which has no verifiable connection to the documented world. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone through remote areas late at night, I watch for blue-white lights in the distance and listen for electronically modulated voices on empty CB channels. I wonder what kind of medical supplies require that level of security and secrecy, what kind of research takes place in facilities that don't officially exist, and whether I'll ever be called upon again to make a delivery to coordinates that lead to nowhere. The mountains keep their secrets well, and the people who work in hidden facilities understand that some medical breakthroughs require protection from a world that isn't ready to know they exist. But sometimes, when critical supplies are needed in places that can't be reached through normal channels, they call drivers like me, who are willing to follow GPS coordinates into the darkness and ask no questions about what we're carrying or where we're taking it. The haunting part isn't the mystery of what I delivered that night, or even the impossible technology that provided security escort through terrain that shouldn't have roads. The haunting part is the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains, research continues on compounds and treatments that could change the world if the world were ready to accept them. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, emergency calls go out to drivers who understand that the most important deliveries are often the ones that never officially happened, carrying cargo that doesn't exist to destinations that aren't on any map, escorted by lights that appear only when something vital needs to be transported beyond the boundaries of the normal world. Stranded on a forgotten highway, the true truck story that still can't be explained. From Patricia. My name is Patricia Coleman, and I've been driving long-haul routes for 19 years, covering every major highway system in the continental United States. I pride myself on knowing the roads, understanding traffic patterns, and never getting lost even in the most remote areas. But 3 years ago, I found myself stranded on a highway that shouldn't exist, in a place that maps insist was never built, experiencing something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the American road system. I was hauling furniture from a manufacturer in North Carolina to retail outlets in Colorado, running a route I'd driven dozens of times before. Interstate 40 west through Tennessee, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, then north on Interstate 35 through Kansas, before cutting west again toward Denver. Standard cross-country run, good weather forecast, no construction delays expected. The problem started in eastern Oklahoma, just past the Arkansas border, when road construction forced traffic onto a detour that wasn't marked on my GPS or mentioned in any of the construction updates I'd received before departure. Orange signs directed westbound traffic off Interstate 40 onto what appeared to be a newly constructed 4-lane highway that ran parallel to the main interstate. The detour route was well maintained and clearly marked, with proper signage indicating it was a temporary bypass around construction work that would last several weeks. Mile markers showed normal progression, rest areas appeared at regular intervals, and the road surface was smooth and recently paved. Nothing suggested it was anything other than a standard construction detour that would eventually loop back to interstate. But after driving for 2 hours on the detour route, I realized that it hadn't curved back toward the main interstate as it should have. According to my odometer, I'd traveled nearly 120 miles on what was supposed to be a temporary bypass, and the road continued straight west through terrain that didn't match any of the topographical features I expected to find in eastern Oklahoma. I tried to check my position using GPS, but all 3 of my navigation systems showed conflicting information. One indicated I was still on Interstate 40, another showed me in a location that corresponded to no mapped roads, and the third displayed an error message stating that my position couldn't be determined from available satellite data. My CB radio picked up normal trucker chatter, but when I asked other drivers about the construction detour and how long it continued, I received responses that didn't make sense. What construction detour, driver? Interstate 40's running clear and smooth through Oklahoma today. Negative on any detour eastbound. Been monitoring traffic reports all morning. No construction delays reported anywhere in the state, but I was clearly driving on a well-constructed 4-lane highway with proper signage and normal traffic flow. Other vehicles were using the same route, passenger cars, commercial trucks, even state highway patrol vehicles that suggested official recognition and oversight of the roadway. I tried calling my dispatcher to report the navigation problems, but my phone showed no signal, despite being in an area that should have had excellent cellular coverage. The isolation was becoming problematic, not just for communication but for basic safety protocols that required regular check-ins with dispatch during long-haul runs. As daylight faded, I looked for a truck stop or rest area where I could park for my mandatory break and try to determine exactly where I was and how to get back to my planned route. But while the highway had all the infrastructure of a major interstate, proper lighting, clear lane markings, appropriate signage, it lacked the commercial development that should have existed along such a well-traveled corridor. No truck stops, no gas stations, no restaurants or motels. Just an endless four-lane highway running through landscape that seemed oddly generic, as if it had been constructed through terrain that was deliberately chosen for its lack of distinguishing features. The first rest area I found was standard government construction: concrete picnic tables, restroom facilities, vending machines, and parking areas designed for both passenger vehicles and commercial trucks. But when I tried to use the vending machines, they accepted my coins and made normal operational sounds without dispensing any products. The restroom facilities were clean and functional, but the water from the faucets had no taste or temperature, as if it were somehow artificial. More disturbing was the complete absence of litter or wear that should have been present at a highway rest stop. No cigarette butts, no food wrappers, no graffiti, no sign that other travelers had ever used the facilities despite the evidence of regular traffic on the highway. I spent the night parked at the rest area, hoping that morning light would provide better visibility and maybe help me understand where the mysterious highway led. But dawn brought only more questions and a growing sense that I wasn't just lost, I was somewhere that didn't correspond to any real geographic location. My truck's engine started normally, all systems showed proper readings, and fuel consumption had been normal throughout the previous day's driving. But when I tried to retrace my route back toward Interstate 40, I discovered that the on-ramps I'd used to enter the detour highway were no longer there. The road continued in both directions as far as I could see, but there were no exits, no intersections, no way to leave the highway except by continuing to drive in one direction or the other. I was trapped on a road that had no beginning and no end, no connection to the normal highway system that I'd spent 19 years navigating. Panic set in as the implications became clear. I had enough fuel for maybe 400 more miles, enough food and water for 2 days, and no way to communicate with the outside world or request assistance. If I couldn't find an exit from this impossible highway, I would eventually run out of fuel in a location that apparently didn't exist on any map. I decided to drive west, following the same direction I'd been traveling when I entered the highway, hoping to find either an exit or some kind of explanation for where I was and how to get back to normal roads. But as the morning wore on, the landscape became even more generic and featureless. Flat plains, with scattered trees, occasional hills that rose and fell with mathematical regularity, sky that seemed too uniform in color and cloud patterns. It felt like driving through a computer simulation rather than actual terrain, as if the highway existed in some kind of artificial environment that approximated reality without actually being real. The breakthrough came when I noticed that other vehicles on the highway were exhibiting strange behaviors. Cars and trucks would appear in my mirrors, maintain speed and distance for a while, then simply vanish without taking any exits or changing lane. New vehicles would materialize ahead of me, follow normal traffic patterns for a few miles, then disappear as suddenly as they'd appear. I was sharing the highway with traffic that wasn't entirely real, vehicles that existed only as long as they were needed to maintain the illusion of normal highway activity. The test was simple but terrifying. I slowed down significantly, forcing the vehicles behind me to either pass or adapt to my reduced speed. Instead of normal driver behavior, passing, honking, or maintaining distance, they began to flicker like bad television reception, becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. The highway was generating phantom traffic to maintain the appearance of normal road conditions, but the illusion couldn't withstand direct interaction or close scrutiny. By afternoon, I was running low on fuel with no gas stations in sight and no exits to lead me back to real roads, where fuel was available. Desperation forced me to try something that violated every safety protocol I'd learned in 19 years of professional driving. I drove off the highway, not onto an exit ramp or service road, but directly off the pavement onto the grass median, then across the eastbound lanes and into the empty fields beyond. My truck wasn't designed for off-road driving, but the alternative was running out of fuel on a highway that existed nowhere except in my immediate experience. The moment my tires left the pavement, everything changed. The impossible highway vanished behind me, as if it had never existed, replaced by normal Oklahoma countryside with familiar landmarks and proper cellular signal strength. My GPS systems immediately reacquired satellites and displayed my correct location, a rural area about 30 miles south of Interstate 40, with no four-lane highways or construction detours anywhere in the vicinity. I was exactly where I should have been, according to my planned route, but I'd lost almost 18 hours and nearly a full tank of fuel reaching a location that I should have reached 6 hours earlier by staying on Interstate. My dispatcher was concerned but not panicked when I finally re-established contact. According to her records, I'd been maintaining normal progress and had checked in regularly throughout the previous day, though I had no memory of making those calls and my phone showed no record of outgoing communication. The explanation she provided was that I'd been driving through an area with poor cellular coverage that caused intermittent signal problems, and that my GPS navigation had been affected by atmospheric conditions that occasionally disrupted satellite reception in certain geographic regions. But I knew what I'd experienced was more than simple technical difficulties. I'd driven for 18 hours on a highway that didn't exist, through landscape that felt artificially generated, sharing the road with phantom traffic that disappeared when observed too closely. Research into similar phenomena revealed scattered reports from other drivers, who described getting lost on well-maintained highways that led nowhere, becoming stranded on roads that couldn't be found on maps, experiencing navigation problems that resolved themselves only when they abandoned their vehicles and walked away from impossible routes. Most of these reports were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations, GPS malfunctions, or simple navigation errors compounded by stress and disorientation. But the consistency of details, the generic landscape, the phantom traffic, the complete isolation from normal communication networks, suggested something more systematic than individual delusion. I've driven past that area of Oklahoma dozens of times since then, always watching for signs of the detour that led me onto an impossible highway. I've never seen those orange construction signs again, never found any evidence that the route I followed for 18 hours ever existed. But sometimes, usually late at night when I'm driving alone through remote areas, I see other trucks that seem to be following routes that don't correspond to any mapped roads. Vehicles that appear to be traveling on parallel highways that should be visible but aren't. Drivers who look confused or frightened as they navigate roads that exist in spaces between the documented transportation infrastructure. The American highway system is vast and complex, connecting thousands of cities and towns across terrain that ranges from desert to mountains to plains. But within that documented network, there appear to be spaces where roads exist that aren't on any map, routes that lead to destinations that have no official existence. And sometimes, when construction detours force traffic onto alternate routes, drivers find themselves on highways that challenge the basic assumptions about geography, navigation, and the nature of the roads that carry us from one place to another. The frightening truth isn't that I got lost for 18 hours on a highway that doesn't exist. The frightening truth is that it does exist, in spaces between the mapped world, waiting for drivers who make a wrong turn or follow a detour sign that leads them into terrain that operates by different rules than the normal world. Some roads don't take you from where you are to where you want to go. Some roads exist in their own reality, creating their own geography, generating their own traffic, and trapping drivers in routes that have no beginning and no end, except the moment when you abandon them completely and walk back to the world that exists on maps and GPS systems, and in the collective memory of people who have never been stranded on highways that shouldn't exist. The phantom hitchhiker who rode with me for 200 miles in the dead of night. From Raymond. My name is Raymond Clark, and I've been driving solo runs between Seattle and Los Angeles for 12 years, a route that takes me through some of the loneliest stretches of highway on the West Coast. I've always been selective about picking up hitchhikers, but on a cold November night in 2022, I made an exception that led to the strangest passenger experience of my driving career. I was southbound on Interstate 5 through Central California, hauling electronic components from a Boeing supplier to aerospace contractors in the Los Angeles area. It was just past midnight, and I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, fighting fatigue and the hypnotic effect of endless highway stretching through the San Joaquin Valley in complete darkness. The figure appeared in my headlights about 50 miles north of Bakersfield, standing on the shoulder with his thumb extended in the classic hitchhiker pose. He was wearing what looked like a military surplus jacket and jeans, with a small duffel bag at his feet. Nothing unusual about his appearance or posture, just another stranded traveler looking for a ride south. I normally don't pick up hitchhikers, especially not during night runs when visibility is limited and the risk of problems is higher. But something about this particular individual compelled me to pull over. Maybe the professional way he stood at attention when my headlights illuminated him, or the sense that he was genuinely stranded rather than working some kind of scam. He climbed into the passenger seat with economical movements that suggested military training, settling his duffel bag at his feet and buckling the seatbelt without saying a word. He appeared to be in his 30s, with short cropped hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from spending time outdoors in harsh conditions. "Appreciate the ride," he said as I pulled back onto the highway. "Name's Miller. I'm trying to get to Los Angeles. Ray Clark. I can take you as far as the LA area, but it's going to be several hours of driving. You okay with that?" "Time's not a problem," he replied. "I've got nowhere else to be." For the first hour, Miller was an ideal passenger. He sat quietly, occasionally commenting on road conditions or asking about my route, but generally respecting the concentration required for night driving. His presence actually made the journey more pleasant. Having someone to talk to helped fight off the fatigue that often plagued solo drivers during the empty hours between midnight and dawn. But as we drove deeper into the valley, I began to notice things about my passenger that didn't quite add up. His military jacket looked authentic, but worn in ways that suggested decades of use rather than recent purchase. The fabric had the kind of fading and wear patterns that come from years of field service, but Miller appeared too young to have accumulated that much military experience. More puzzling was his knowledge of the route. Despite claiming to be unfamiliar with California highways, he accurately predicted upcoming exits, construction zones, and even the locations of specific truck stops along Interstate 5. When I asked how he knew so much about the road, he said he'd studied maps before starting his journey, but his knowledge was too detailed, too current to come from map study. He knew about construction delays that weren't marked on signs, warned me about speed traps that weren't visible until we passed them, even commented on changes to truck stop facilities that had occurred within the past few months. "How long have you been traveling?" I asked during a stretch of straight highway south of Fresno. "Long time," he said. "Seems like I've been on the road forever, trying to get back to Los Angeles." "Back? You lived there before?" "Yeah, I had family there. People I need to see. Things I need to finish up." There was something in his tone that suggested sadness or regret, but when I glanced over at him, his profile was turned toward the window, watching the dark landscape roll past. The dashboard lights revealed that his jacket had patches and insignia that looked military, but they were too faded for me to read clearly. Around 2 a.m., we stopped for fuel at a truck stop near Coalinga, and I got my first good look at Miller under bright light. What I saw made me question everything about our interaction up to that point. His jacket wasn't just worn, it was vintage, with styling and materials that looked decades out of date. The patches were from military units I didn't recognize, with designs that seemed older than anything currently in use. More unsettling was Miller's behavior at the truck stop. He didn't go inside to use the facilities or buy snacks, just stood beside the truck looking south toward Los Angeles, with an expression of intense longing. When other people walked near him, they seemed to shiver slightly or change direction, as if unconsciously avoiding his presence. "You coming inside?" I asked. "No, I'll wait here. Don't need anything." I bought coffee and snacks for both of us, but when I returned to the truck, Miller politely declined the food and drink, said he wasn't hungry or thirsty, that he was fine just riding along and didn't need anything except to keep moving south toward his destination. Back on the highway, Miller's conversation became more personal and revealing. He talked about his time in the service, about friends he'd served with, about the family he was trying to reach in Los Angeles. But the details he provided were confusing and contradictory. He mentioned serving in Vietnam, but he appeared too young to have been part of that conflict. He talked about friends who had been killed in action, about promises he'd made to visit their families, about obligations he needed to fulfill before he could rest. His stories had the detailed authenticity of lived experience, but they described events that seemed to have occurred before he was born. "What year did you get out of the service?" I asked. 1973, he said without hesitation. Been trying to get home ever since. Seek. That was 50 years ago. If Miller had left the military in 1973, he would be well into his 70s now, not the 30-something man sitting in my passenger seat. But he spoke with the certainty of someone recounting personal memories, not stories he'd heard from others. As we climbed through the Grapevine Pass into Los Angeles County, Miller became more agitated and talkative. He started pointing out landmarks and changes to the highway, comparing current conditions to what he remembered from previous trips. But his comparisons referenced road configurations and features that had been changed decades ago. "They moved that off-ramp," he said as we passed through the Tejon Pass. "Used to be about a quarter-mile further south. And that truck stop there, that's new. Used to be just open land." The truck stop he was referring to had been built in the 1980s, but it looked new to someone who had last traveled this route in 19. The strangest part of the journey came as we descended into the San Fernando Valley, and Miller began to direct me toward his specific destination in Los Angeles. Instead of asking me to take him to a bus station or drop him at an intersection, he provided precise directions to a residential neighborhood in East LA. Turn left at the next exit, then right on Whittier Boulevard, then left on Soto Street. The directions were accurate and detailed, leading through surface streets to a neighborhood of small houses and apartment buildings that looked like they'd been built in the 1950s and 1960s. But as we drove through the area, Miller's excitement turned to confusion and disappointment. "This isn't right," he said, looking around at houses and businesses that seemed to confuse him. "Everything's changed. Where's the Gonzalez family house? Where's the corner market where I was supposed to meet them? When were you last here?" I asked. "Should have been here in 19... I promised I'd come see them, tell them about their son, about what happened to him over there. But I never made it back from the road." The implications of his statement sent chills down my spine. Miller wasn't just a hitchhiker trying to get to Los Angeles. He was someone who had been trying to complete a journey for 50 years, carrying news about a dead soldier to a family that might no longer exist. We drove through the neighborhood for 20 minutes, Miller becoming increasingly distressed as he failed to find the landmarks and addresses he remembered. Houses had been torn down and rebuilt, businesses had changed hands. Entire blocks had been transformed by decades of urban development. "They're gone," he said finally. "The people I came to see, they're probably gone. Been too long. What happened to you in 1973? I asked. "Why didn't you make it back then?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the transformed neighborhood. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the engine noise. "Accident on the highway. Never made it to deliver the message. Been trying to get back here ever since, but the road keeps changing, and time keeps moving, and the people I was supposed to see keep getting further away." I pulled over to the curb and turned to look at my passenger directly. In the streetlight illumination, I could see through him to the seat fabric behind. Miller wasn't entirely solid. He was translucent, like a projected image or a reflection in glass. "You died in 1973, I said, not as a question but as a statement of understanding. "Yeah," he admitted. "Car accident somewhere north of here. Been hitchhiking ever since, trying to complete the trip, but every time I get close, everything's different from how I remember it. Miller had been riding with drivers for 50 years, always trying to reach Los Angeles, always finding that the city had changed too much for him to complete his mission. He was trapped in a cycle of endless travel, unable to rest until he delivered a message to people who were no longer alive to receive it. What was the message? I asked. Their son died saving my life in Vietnam. Wanted them to know he was brave, that he talked about them every day, that he loved them and missed them right up to the end. Promised him I'd tell them in person. I spent the rest of the night driving Miller through neighborhoods where his military friends' families had once lived, helping him search for any trace of the people he'd been trying to reach for half a century. We found a few elderly residents who remembered some of the names he mentioned, who confirmed that the families had moved away or passed on decades earlier. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Miller began to fade visibly, his form becoming more transparent as the sun rose higher. He seemed to understand that his time was limited, that whatever force allowed him to hitchhike through the night would dissipate with daylight. "Thank you," he said as I parked the truck at a rest area overlooking the city. "For the ride, for listening, for helping me look. I think maybe it's time to stop trying to deliver messages to people who can't receive them." "What will you do now?" "Find peace, I hope. Been carrying this burden for 50 years, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the intention to deliver the message is what mattered, not actually completing the delivery." As the sun reached full brightness, Miller smiled and touched the window glass one final time. "Tell people about the soldiers who didn't make it home. Tell them we tried to keep our promises." Then he was gone, leaving only an empty passenger seat and the lingering scent of old canvas and military surplus fabric. I've driven that route between Seattle and Los Angeles dozens of times since then, and I always watch the shoulders for hitchhikers who might need rides. But I've never seen Miller again, and I've never picked up another passenger who seemed to exist partially in another time. The highways are full of stories about phantom hitchhikers, travelers who appear and disappear without explanation, passengers who turn out to be ghosts, or spirits trying to complete interrupted journeys. Most drivers dismiss these stories as urban legends or fatigue-induced hallucinations. But I know that some hitchhikers are carrying burdens heavier than any physical luggage, traveling distances measured not in miles, but in decades, trying to deliver messages that time has made impossible to deliver. And sometimes all they need is a driver willing to help them search for closure, even when closure means accepting that some promises can't be kept and some journeys can't be completed. Miller taught me that the dead don't always rest peacefully when they have unfinished business among the living. But he also taught me that sometimes the burden of carrying undelivered messages becomes heavier than the messages themselves, and that peace comes not from completing impossible tasks, but from accepting that the intention to complete them is enough. The highways remember everyone who travels them, including those who died trying to reach destinations they never saw. And sometimes on lonely nights when the road stretches empty in both directions, those travelers find drivers willing to help them make one last attempt to finish journeys that began decades ago and will finally end when the sun rises on a new day. Alone in the cab, a trucker's terrifying ordeal with voices on the empty road, from Sandra. "My name is Sandra Hayes, and I've been driving team runs with my husband Dale for 15 years, covering long-haul routes across the country in a partnership that's kept us safe and profitable through good times and economic downturns. We've always been a team, sharing driving duties, navigation responsibilities, and the companionship that makes long-distance trucking bearable for married couples who choose to work and travel together. But last spring, Dale was hospitalized with pneumonia during a delivery run to Phoenix, leaving me to complete the return trip to our home base in Missouri alone for the first time in our marriage. I'd driven solo runs before we partnered up, but after 15 years of constant companionship, the prospect of covering 1,200 miles without my husband felt daunting and strangely frightening. Dale was stable and recovering well, but the doctors insisted on keeping him for at least a week of antibiotic treatment and observation. Our company needed the truck back in Missouri for another contracted run, and I was the only driver available to complete the delivery. Despite Dale's concern about me driving such a long distance alone, I was confident in my abilities and eager to prove that I could handle solo runs when necessary. The first day went smoothly. I drove from Phoenix to Albuquerque without incident, maintaining good time and comfortable with the familiar cab, despite Dale's absence. The truck felt larger without his presence, the sleeper berth eerily quiet without his snoring, but I'd driven enough miles over the years to handle the solitude without significant difficulty. It was the second night, somewhere in the empty stretches of eastern New Mexico, that I first heard Dale's voice. I was climbing through a mountain pass around 2 a.m., focused on maintaining speed and watching for wildlife that might wander onto the highway, when I clearly heard my husband say, "Sandra, watch your following distance," from the passenger seat. It was his voice exactly, with the same tone and inflection he used when providing gentle reminders during our normal team driving. I glanced over at the passenger seat, expecting to see nothing but darkness and empty space. Instead, for just a moment, I could swear I saw Dale's silhouette in the dim dashboard lighting, his familiar profile turned toward the windshield, as if he were monitoring traffic conditions ahead. But when I looked again, the passenger seat was empty. I called out, feeling foolish for speaking to an empty cab, but unable to shake the certainty that I'd heard his voice and seen his presence. No response, just the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of wind around the cab. I convinced myself that fatigue was creating auditory hallucinations, that 15 years of constant companionship had created such strong mental patterns that my brain was filling in expected sounds and sights, even when Dale wasn't physically present. But the voices continued throughout the night, always Dale's voice, always providing the kind of guidance and commentary he would normally offer during long drives. Warnings about upcoming curves, reminders to check mirrors, suggestions about fuel stops and route adjustments. All in his voice, all accurate and helpful, all coming from an empty passenger seat. "Fuel stop in 12 miles, honey. Might want to top off before we hit the long stretch through Texas. State Patrol likes to sit behind that overpass up ahead. Better check your speed. CB's picking up reports of an accident at mile marker 20. Might want to take the alternate route." Every suggestion was accurate. The fuel stop was exactly where Dale's voice had indicated. The state patrol car was positioned behind the overpass, and traffic reports confirmed the accident at mile marker 20. But Dale was 800 miles away in a Phoenix hospital, recovering from pneumonia and certainly not monitoring New Mexico highway conditions. I tried calling Dale on his cell phone, but the call went directly to voicemail, and the hospital had probably sedated him for the night. There was no way he could be providing real-time navigation assistance from his hospital bed. Yet his voice continued to guide me through the night, offering advice that proved consistently accurate and helpful. As I crossed into Texas, the voices became more frequent and more personal. Instead of just navigation assistance, Dale began offering the kind of emotional support and conversation that had sustained our partnership through thousands of miles of shared driving. "You're doing great, Sandra. Handling this solo run like a pro. Remember that time we got caught in the ice storm outside Amarillo? You kept us on the road when I wanted to pull over and wait it out. I'm proud of you for taking this on. Knew you could handle anything the road could throw at you." The conversations were comforting and familiar, exactly the kind of encouragement Dale would provide during difficult stretches of driving. But they were also impossible, since Dale was unconscious in a hospital bed hundreds of miles away. I began to wonder if the voices were some kind of psychological coping mechanism, my mind's way of dealing with the stress and loneliness of long-distance driving without my usual partner. Maybe 15 years of marriage and professional partnership had created such strong mental connections that I could unconsciously predict what Dale would say in any given situation. But the voices included information that I didn't possess independently. Construction starting at mile marker 56 is going to create delays. Better take Highway 2087 through the back roads. I had no knowledge of construction at mile marker 56, but when I reached that location, orange signs confirmed that roadwork was indeed causing significant delays. The alternate route Dale's voice had suggested saved me nearly 2 hours compared to waiting in construction traffic. Truck stop at exit 23 has the best coffee and cleanest restrooms between here and Oklahoma City. I'd never stopped at that particular truck stop, but when I took Dale's advice and pulled in for a break, the facilities were exactly as described: excellent coffee and immaculate restrooms that made the stop worthwhile. The voices were providing information that I didn't have access to independently, suggesting that whatever was happening was more than simple psychological projection or wishful thinking. By the third day of driving, Dale's voice had been joined by others. Truckers I'd known over the years, dispatchers from previous companies, even drivers I'd met only briefly at truck stops or loading docks. All of them offering advice, providing companionship, sharing the collective wisdom of thousands of miles of road experience. Sandra, this is Big Jim from that run to Seattle last year. That off-ramp coming up has a sharp curve. Better take it easy. Hey there, Sandra. This is Betty from Dispatch at Transcorp. Weather Service is calling for severe storms south of Oklahoma City. Might want to adjust your timing. Sandra, honey, this is your dad. You remember how I taught you to handle crosswinds when you were learning to drive? Same principles apply with the big rig. My father had died 5 years earlier, but his voice was unmistakable, offering driving advice with the same patient tone he'd used when teaching me to handle our family car during high school. The presence of deceased voices among the helpful commentators was deeply unsettling, but also strangely comforting. I was surrounded by an invisible community of experienced drivers, all of them offering support and guidance for my solo journey home. The cab felt crowded with presence and conversation, filled with voices that provided the companionship and expertise that normally came from Dale's physical presence in the passenger seat. But the voices began to include warnings about more serious dangers than construction delays and fuel stops. Sandra, there's something wrong with that blue pickup truck that's been following you for the last 30 miles. He's maintaining distance but not passing, and he's got out-of-state plates. I checked my mirrors and saw the pickup truck Dale's voice had mentioned. It had indeed been maintaining the same distance for an extended period. Unusual behavior for normal highway traffic. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I adjusted speed, it matched my changes exactly. Sandra, I think you've got a problem back there. That's not normal driving behavior. The voice belonged to Charlie Morrison, a veteran driver I'd met at a truck stop in Colorado 2 years earlier. Charlie had mentioned being concerned about predators who targeted solo drivers, especially women, by following them until they stopped at isolated locations. Take the next exit and pull into the truck stop there. See if he follows you off the highway. I followed the advice, taking an exit that led to a well-lit truck stop with good visibility and other commercial vehicle. The blue pickup truck continued past the exit without stopping, confirming that it had indeed been following me with potentially hostile intentions. The voices had protected me from a danger I might not have recognized until too late. As I approached the Oklahoma border, the conversations became more intense and personal. Multiple voices would overlap, creating a cacophony of advice, warnings, and encouragement that sometimes made it difficult to concentrate on driving. The cab felt overcrowded with invisible passengers, all of them talking at once, all trying to help but creating confusion through their simultaneous input. Sandra, you need to pull over and rest. You've been driving too long. No, Sandra, keep going. You're making good time, and the weather's going to turn bad if you delay. Watch that semi merging from the right. He doesn't see you. Fuel stop coming up in 5 miles. Better top off before Oklahoma. That car ahead is weaving. Probably a drunk driver. Give him plenty of room. The competing voices created a sensory overload that was becoming dangerous. I needed Dale's voice to take precedence, to provide the primary guidance that would help me filter out the less essential commentary from other sources. "Dale," I said aloud, "I need you to be my main navigator." The other voices are helping, but there are too many of them talking at once. Immediately the other voices faded to a whisper, and Dale's voice came through clearly and distinctly. "I'm here, Sandra. Let me handle the primary communication. The others will chime in only if there's something critical I miss." For the remainder of the journey, Dale's voice provided steady, reliable guidance, while the other voices served as a background chorus of support and encouragement. The arrangement felt natural and comforting, like having a CB radio tuned to a channel where experienced drivers shared information and looked out for each other. I reached Missouri safely, completing the solo run without incident, and with better time than Dale and I normally made as a team. The voices had provided navigation assistance, safety warnings, and emotional support that made the journey not just bearable, but actually enjoyable. But when I parked the truck at our home base and shut off the engine, the voices fell silent. The cab felt empty and quiet, no longer filled with the presence and conversation that had sustained me through 1,200 miles of solo driving. Dale recovered fully from his pneumonia and rejoined me for our next run, but I never told him about the voices that had guided me home in his absence. How could I explain that his voice had provided navigation assistance while he was unconscious in a hospital bed? How could I describe conversations with deceased drivers who offered advice about road conditions they couldn't possibly monitor? But Dale seemed to know something had happened during my solo run. "You handled that trip like you had help," he said as we prepared for our next delivery. "Drove it faster and safer than we usually manage as a team. Maybe I learned more from you over the years than I realized," I replied. "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe the road takes care of drivers who need help, especially when they're carrying more than they can handle alone." I've made several solo runs since then, always listening for the voices that provide guidance and companionship during the lonely miles between destinations. They don't appear every time, only when I really need them, when the distance is long and the challenges are significant. But when they do appear, I'm surrounded by an invisible community of drivers who understand the unique demands of long-haul trucking and the importance of looking out for each other, even when physical presence isn't possible. The highways are filled with more than just visible traffic. They carry the accumulated experience and wisdom of everyone who has ever driven them, and sometimes when drivers need help most, that collective knowledge becomes available as voices that provide guidance, warnings, and the companionship that makes even the loneliest roads bearable. Some people might call them hallucinations or psychological coping mechanisms. But I know they're real, because they provide information I don't have access to independently and guidance that consistently proves accurate and helpful. The voices are the highway's way of ensuring that no driver is ever truly alone, even when they're separated by hundreds of miles from their usual partners and support systems. Dale and I drive as a team again, but I'm no longer afraid of solo run. I know that when I really need help, the voices will be there, providing the navigation assistance and emotional support that turn solitude into community and make every journey safer than it would be if I were truly driving alone. The Forgotten Rest Stop, a place every driver says you should never pull over. From Carlos. My name is Carlos Mendez, and I've been running routes through the Southwest for 22 years, specializing in freight between California and Texas on highways that cross some of the emptiest, most desolate terrain in North America. In all those years, I've stopped at hundreds of rest areas, truck stops, and roadside facilities, but there's one location that every experienced driver in the region knows about, and every smart driver avoids completely. Mile marker 207 on Highway 285 between Roswell and Carlsbad, New Mexico. The forgotten rest stop that appears on some maps but not others, that exists when you need it most, but disappears when you try to find it deliberately. Every driver who's been in the business long enough has heard stories about the place, and most of us have been warned never to pull over there, no matter how desperate we might be for fuel, food. But sometimes when you're fighting fatigue and facing another 100 miles of empty highway, Desperation overrides caution. I first heard about the forgotten rest stop during my second year of driving, from an old-timer named Frank Delacroix, who'd been hauling freight through the Southwest since. Frank was the kind of veteran driver who knew every trick for staying alert, every shortcut that could save time, and every dangerous location that should be avoided at all costs. Mile marker 127, he told me over coffee at a truck stop outside Amarillo. Place looks normal enough. Clean restrooms, vending machines, picnic tables, everything you'd expect from a state highway facility. But something's not right about it. Drivers who stop there report strange experiences, lost time, confusion about where they are and how they got there. What kind of strange experiences? I asked. Frank shook his head. Different for everyone. Some drivers say they pull in for a 10-minute break and realize they've been there for hours. Others remember having conversations with people who weren't there when they looked again. Few drivers claim they met themselves, like they encountered their own reflection walking around the rest area. It sounded like the kind of urban legend that truck drivers love to share, but Frank was serious, and his reputation for honesty and accuracy was well established among drivers who worked the Southwest routes. My advice, he continued, is to fuel up in Roswell and drive straight through to Carlsbad, no matter how tired you get. That stretch of 2085 has some kind of problem around mile marker 120. And whatever's going on there, it's not good for drivers who need to stay alert and keep moving. I took Frank's advice for years, always making sure I had enough fuel to bypass the area around mile marker 127, always pushing through fatigue rather than risking a stop at the forgotten rest area. But advice becomes harder to follow when you're facing genuine emergency conditions that require immediate attention. The situation that forced me to break my own rule occurred during a December run from Los Angeles to Dallas, hauling computer equipment that required delivery before the end of the fiscal year. I'd been delayed by weather in California, then hit construction delays in Arizona, and by the time I reached New Mexico, I was running on minimal sleep and facing a schedule that required continuous driving to meet my deadline. Somewhere south of Roswell, my truck developed a coolant leak that wasn't serious enough to cause immediate engine damage, but concerning enough to require monitoring and possible repair. The temperature gauge showed elevated readings that could become dangerous if I continued driving without at least checking the cooling system and adding fluid if necessary. I had coolant in the truck, but the leak needed to be located and assessed before I could determine whether it was safe to continue driving, and I needed to stop somewhere with adequate lighting and space to examine the engine compartment properly. Mile marker 207 appeared in my headlights, just as I was beginning to worry about finding a suitable place to stop. The rest area sign looked standard, clean, well-maintained, promising the facilities I needed to address the mechanical problem safely. Despite every warning I'd ever heard about the location, I pulled into the forgotten rest stop. The facility appeared normal at first glance. Standard concrete picnic tables, brick restroom buildings, vending machines, and adequate lighting for basic maintenance work. But as I parked and shut off the engine, I noticed details that seemed somehow wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what was bothering me. The picnic tables were too clean, as if they'd never been used. The vending machines hummed with electrical power, but displayed no product selections behind their glass fronts. The restroom buildings showed no signs of wear or graffiti, despite being located on a highway that saw heavy commercial traffic. Everything looked new but felt old, as if the facility existed in a state of permanent preservation that prevented normal aging and wear. I popped the hood and began examining the cooling system, using a flashlight to trace coolant lines and look for signs of leakage. The problem was minor, a loose hose clamp that had allowed a small amount of coolant to escape, and easily fixed with basic tools. But as I worked on the repair, I became aware that I wasn't alone at the rest area. Footsteps on concrete, the sound of car doors closing, voices and quiet conversation. Normal sounds for a roadside facility, except that I hadn't seen any other vehicles pull in, and when I looked around, the parking area appeared empty except for my truck. "Excuse me, driver," You need any help with that? I turned around to see a man in coveralls approaching from the direction of the restroom building. He appeared to be a mechanic or maintenance worker, carrying a toolbox and walking with the confident stride of someone familiar with engine problems. Just a loose hose clamp, I replied. Got it under control, but thanks for asking. Good deal. These older trucks, you gotta stay on top of the maintenance. Can't afford to break down out here in the middle of nowhere. He was right about that, but something about his comment bothered me. My truck was relatively new, less than 3 years old, not the older truck he'd referenced. And when I looked at him more carefully, his coveralls and tools had the same overly pristine appearance as the rest area facilities. New but somehow timeless. You work here? Been here longer than I can remember, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Help out drivers who need assistance. Not many people stop here anymore, but the ones who do usually need some. I finished tightening the hose clamp and closed the hood, ready to get back on the road and put some distance between myself and the forgotten rest stop. But when I turned to thank the mechanic for his offer of help, he was gone. The parking area was empty, no sign that anyone had been there except for my own footprints on the concrete. I climbed back into the truck and started the engine, but before I could put it in gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been parked at the rest area for 4 hours. 4 hours. But I'd only been there for 20 minutes, 30 at most. I'd fixed a simple hose clamp, had a brief conversation with a mysterious mechanic, and somehow lost nearly 4 hours of time that I desperately needed to meet my delivery deadline. The fuel gauge confirmed the impossible time loss. The engine had been idling for hours, consuming diesel that should have lasted much longer if I'd only been stopped for a few minutes. But I had clear, continuous memory of the entire stop, no sense of lost consciousness or missing time. I'd experienced the phenomenon that Frank Delacroix had warned me about, the temporal distortion that made the forgotten rest stop so dangerous for drivers who needed to maintain strict schedules and stay alert for long-distance driving. As I pulled back onto Highway 2085, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe I'd dozed off while working on the truck and dreamed the conversation with the mechanic. But my body didn't feel like I'd slept, and the mechanical repair had been real and effective. The coolant leak was fixed, the engine temperature had returned to normal, and I was able to complete the run to Dallas without further mechanical problems. But I'd lost 4 critical hours at a rest area that seemed to exist in a bubble of distorted time. I never reported the incident to anyone, partly because I couldn't explain it, and partly because I'd violated my own rule about avoiding mile markers. But over the years, I've heard similar stories from other drivers who've been forced by circumstances to stop at the forgotten rest area. Lost time is the most common experience, but drivers also report meeting people who shouldn't exist, having conversations that couldn't have happened, encountering other versions of themselves, and experiencing mechanical problems that resolve themselves without explanation. Some drivers theorize that the rest area exists at some kind of temporal intersection, a place where different times and realities overlap in ways that create confusion and distortion for anyone who spends time. Others believe it's a trap of some kind, designed to delay drivers or extract something from them during the missing hours. But most experienced drivers simply accept it as one of the inexplicable hazards of long-distance trucking, a location that demonstrates that the highways contain more than just asphalt and signage. Some places operate by different rules than the normal world, and the forgotten rest stop at mile marker 27 is one of them. I still drive Highway 28. I've learned to manage my fuel consumption and schedule my rest breaks to avoid any situation that might force me to pull over at the forgotten rest area. But sometimes when I'm driving past at night, I see other trucks parked there, their drivers presumably dealing with the same temporal distortions and mysterious encounters that I experienced during my 4 lost hours. I want to warn them, to tell them to get back on the road immediately, but my CB radio never seems to work properly near mile marker. The forgotten rest stop continues to exist, continues to appear when drivers need it most, continues to extract hours from the lives of people who are desperate enough or unfortunate enough to stop there. And every experienced driver in the Southwest knows about it, warns others about it, but can't prevent the occasional circumstances that force good drivers to pull over at a place they know they should avoid. Some stops on the highway don't just offer rest and facilities, they offer experiences that challenge basic assumptions about time, reality, and the nature of roadside infrastructure. And sometimes when you're facing mechanical problems or emergency conditions, you discover that some places are more dangerous than the problems that brought you there in the first place. The forgotten rest stop at mile marker 27 will take your time, but it will also fix your problems and get you back on the road safely. The question every driver has to answer is whether the help is worth the cost, and whether some mechanical problems are better handled on the side of the highway than in facilities that exist partially outside normal time and space. Lights in the sky. The truck driver who vanished after his last CB radio call. From Margaret. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I've been coordinating freight dispatch for Southwest Transport Solutions for 18 years, managing communication with dozens of drivers who cover routes across Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. In all that time, I've dealt with every kind of emergency, breakdown, and delay that can affect long-haul trucking. But I've never had a driver simply vanish without a trace, until the case of Bobby Martinez and the lights he reported seeing in the desert sky. Bobby had been driving for our company for 7 years, specializing in electronic shipments from California manufacturers to distributors throughout the Mountain West. He was reliable, professional, and careful about maintaining regular communication during long runs through remote areas where cellular coverage was spotty and CB radio was often the only way to stay in contact with dispatch. On March 15th, Bobby left Los Angeles with a load of computer components bound for a distribution center in Denver, following his usual route through Nevada and Colorado that would take him through some of the emptiest terrain in the continental United States. The delivery was routine, the weather was clear, and Bobby's truck had just completed a thorough maintenance inspection. Nothing suggested that this would be anything other than a standard 3-day run. Bobby's first check-in came at 6 p.m. as he passed through Barstow, California, right on schedule and reporting normal traffic conditions. His second call came 4 hours later, from near the Nevada border, confirming good fuel economy and an expected arrival in Las Vegas around midnight for his mandatory rest period. But Bobby never reached Las Vegas. His final transmission came through our dispatch radio at 11:47 p.m. from somewhere in the empty desert between California and Nevada, and the content of that call was unlike anything I'd heard in 18 years of coordinating driver communications. Dispatch. This is Unit 40. I need to report unusual aircraft activity in my vicinity. Multiple lights in the sky. Moving in formation, definitely not conventional aircraft. They're maintaining position about half a mile off my starboard side, keeping pace with my truck. I responded immediately. Unit 47. This is dispatch. Can you describe the lights in more detail? Are they helicopter or military aircraft? Negative on helicopters, dispatch. These lights are silent, and they're moving in ways that helicopters can't manage. 3 distinct light sources. Very bright, white light with some blue tinting. They're maintaining perfect formation while moving in patterns that violate normal aircraft capabilities. Bobby's voice was calm and professional, not panicked or confused. He was describing what he saw with the careful attention to detail that made him one of our most reliable drivers. But what he was describing didn't correspond to any normal aircraft activity in the Nevada desert. Unit 47. Are you requesting assistance? Do you want me to contact local authorities? Standby, dispatch. The lights are changing position. They're moving closer to my truck. Jesus. That's bright. They just illuminated my entire rig like it's daytime out here. I can see the desert for miles in every direction. There was a pause in the transmission. Then Bobby's voice returned with obvious excitement and wonder. Dispatch. You're not going to believe this. The lights are directly overhead now, maybe 200 feet above my truck. The illumination is so intense I can read road signs that are half a mile away, and there's no sound at all, completely silent, despite being close enough that I should hear engines or rotors. Unit 47. I'm contacting local authorities to report the aircraft activity. What's your current location? Mile marker 73, on Highway 15, about 40 miles southwest of Las Vegas. But dispatch, I don't think these are normal aircraft. The light pattern is wrong, the movement is wrong, and the silence is impossible for any conventional technology I know about. That was Bobby's assessment, and Bobby was a former Air Force mechanic who understood aircraft capabilities better than most civilian drivers. If he said the lights were behaving in ways that violated normal aviation principles, I took his observation seriously. Unit 47. Are the lights interfering with your ability to drive safely? Do you need to pull over? Negative. Dispatch. Visibility is actually improved with all this illumination, but the lights are doing something new. They're pulsing now, like they're trying to communicate or signal something. Very regular pattern, 3 quick pulses, then a longer pulse, then 3 quick pulses again. The pattern Bobby described was Morse code for SOS, the international distress signal. But distress signals are sent by people in trouble, not by mysterious aircraft operating in restricted desert airspace. Unit 47. I've contacted Nevada Highway Patrol and reported the aircraft activity at your location. They're dispatching units to investigate. Can you continue driving toward Las Vegas? Roger. Dispatch. Maintaining speed and course. The lights are... wait. They're moving again, pulling back to about half a mile distance, but still maintaining formation with my truck. It's like they're escorting me rather than just observing. That was Bobby's last normal transmission. For the next 10 minutes I maintained regular radio contact while he described the lights' continuing escort behavior and their apparent intelligence in responding to his driving actions. When he changed lanes, they adjusted position. When he slowed down, they reduced their forward movement. When he accelerated, they matched his increased speed perfectly. Dispatch. I'm starting to think these lights are specifically interested in my truck or my cargo. This isn't random aircraft activity, they're deliberately interacting with my movements and position. Unit 47. What's your ETA for Las Vegas? Highway patrol units should be reaching your area within 15 minutes. ETA unchanged. Dispatch. Still expecting to reach Vegas by... Hold on. Something's happening. The lights are descending toward my truck. Much closer now. Maybe 50 feet above the trailer. The illumination is so intense I can barely see the road ahead. Bobby's voice was becoming strained, and I could hear electronic interference affecting the radio transmission quality. Unit 47. Can you pull over safely? If the lights are interfering with your vision, it's not safe to continue driving. Trying to find a safe place to stop, but there's no shoulder wide enough for the rig in this section of highway. The lights are... God, they're beautiful. I've never seen anything like this. The whole desert looks like it's glowing, and the light has patterns moving through it like Aurora Borealis, but in the desert. The radio transmission was breaking up, filled with static and electronic noise that made Bobby's voice difficult to understand. Unit 47, you're breaking up. Say again your status and location. Dispatch, the lights are... they're communicating, not with radio, but somehow I can understand what they're trying to tell me. They want me to follow them. They're showing me something important, something about where I need to go. Unit 47, negative on following unknown aircraft. Continue to Las Vegas as planned. Do not deviate from your route. But dispatch, they're showing me things. Images in the light. Places I've never seen but somehow recognize. They're not trying to hurt me. They're trying to help me understand something. Bobby's voice was filled with wonder and excitement, but also with a dreamy quality that suggested he wasn't thinking clearly. Unit 47, maintain your planned route. The lights may be affecting your judgment. Focus on safe driving, and reaching your destination. I understand. Dispatch, the lights are moving away from the highway now. They want me to follow them into the desert. There's something out there they want me to see. Something important. Unit 47 negative on leaving the highway. Stay on your planned route. Do not follow the lights into the desert. That was the last coherent transmission I received from Bobby Martinez. The radio continued to carry electronic noise and fragments of his voice for another few minutes, but nothing clear enough to understand. Then, at 12:23 a.m., the signal cut out entirely. Nevada Highway Patrol units reached the area where Bobby had last reported his position, but they found no trace of his truck, the mysterious lights, or any evidence that a commercial vehicle had passed through the area recently. The highway showed normal traffic patterns, and no other drivers reported unusual aircraft activity. Bobby's truck was equipped with GPS tracking, but the system showed his last known position as mile marker 73 on Highway 15, where it had stopped transmitting at the same time as his final radio call. Satellite imagery of the area showed no vehicles off the highway, no tire tracks leading into the desert, no sign of the truck or driver who had vanished during what appeared to be an encounter with unidentified aircraft. The search effort continued for 2 weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of desert terrain around Bobby's last known position. Federal aviation authorities investigated reports of unauthorized aircraft activity, but found no flight plans, radar contacts, or military exercises that could account for the lights Bobby had described. Bobby Martinez and his truck carrying computer components worth $2.3 million simply disappeared from a well-traveled highway without leaving any physical evidence of their fate. The case remains open, but inactive, classified as a missing person investigation, with no leads or suspects. Bobby's wife continues to believe he'll return someday, with an explanation for what happened that night in the Nevada desert. The insurance company paid out on the truck and cargo after the required waiting period, but they've never closed the file completely. I've coordinated thousands of freight runs since Bobby's disappearance, but I've never had another driver report lights in the sky or mysterious aircraft activity. The incident remains unique in our company's history. A single case of unexplained vanishing that defies any logical explanation. But sometimes, usually late at night, when I'm monitoring radio traffic from drivers crossing remote areas, I hear transmissions that remind me of Bobby's final calls. Drivers reporting unusual lights, aircraft that behave in impossible ways, illumination that transforms the landscape into something beautiful and alien. Most of these reports turn out to be conventional explanations, military exercises, atmospheric phenomena, or fatigue-induced hallucinations, but a few remain unexplained, filed away in my records as reminders that the highways cross terrain, where normal rules don't always apply, and where drivers occasionally encounter things that challenge basic assumptions about what exists in the empty spaces between cities. Bobby Martinez was a good driver, a reliable employee, and a rational person who understood the difference between normal aircraft activity and something genuinely unexplained. His descriptions were detailed, consistent, and delivered with the calm professionalism that made him trustworthy in all other aspects of his work. I believe he encountered something in the Nevada desert that night, something that convinced him to leave his planned route and follow lights into terrain where conventional search efforts couldn't find him. Whether that something was beneficial or harmful, whether Bobby went willingly or was somehow compelled to abandon his truck and cargo, remains unknown. But his case serves as a reminder that long-distance trucking carries risks beyond mechanical breakdown, weather delays, and highway accidents. Some routes cross areas where the unexplained exists alongside the mundane, where drivers occasionally encounter phenomena that official agencies can't acknowledge and search teams can't investigate effectively. The lights that Bobby described are still out there, still appearing to drivers who cross the empty deserts of Nevada and surrounding states. And sometimes, just sometimes, those lights are compelling enough to convince experienced professional drivers to abandon everything they know and follow illumination into unknown territory where earthbound search efforts can't follow. Bobby's last transmission suggested that the lights weren't threatening him, but were trying to show him something important, something that required him to leave the highway and venture into the desert. Whether he found what they wanted to show him, whether he's still alive in some location beyond normal search parameters, remains a mystery that haunts everyone who knew him, and everyone who works in freight dispatch across the Southwest. But his case reminds us that the highways carry more than just commercial traffic, and that some encounters between drivers and the unknown result in disappearances that can't be explained by conventional investigation methods. The lights are still out there, still escorting trucks through the desert night, still offering knowledge or experience that some drivers find irresistible enough to abandon their normal lives and follow illumination into mysteries that ground-based searchers may never solve. The Endless Road, when a trucker drove all night but never reached his destination. From David. My name is David Kowalski, and I've been driving refrigerated loads between Chicago and Miami for 14 years, following Interstate 75 through a route so familiar I could navigate it blindfolded. The journey normally takes about 18 hours, with mandatory rest breaks, covering 1,200 miles of highway that passes through Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida, in a straight line that rarely varies more than a few miles from the optimal path. But last August, I experienced a drive that lasted all night, and covered what felt like thousands of miles without ever reaching my destination, despite following the same road I'd driven successfully hundreds of times before. I left Chicago at 4 p.m. with a load of frozen seafood bound for restaurants in Miami, running a delivery schedule that required me to reach Florida by the following evening. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and my refrigerated trailer was maintaining perfect temperature control for the high-value cargo that demanded careful handling and timely delivery. The first 6 hours went exactly as planned. I made good time through Illinois and Kentucky, stopped for fuel and a mandatory break in Tennessee, and was approaching the Georgia border right on schedule when something began to go wrong with my navigation system. But as I continued south through Georgia, the mileage discrepancy grew larger rather than correcting itself. According to my truck's odometer, I was making normal progress toward Florida, but my GPS insisted I was still in Tennessee, hundreds of miles north of where I should have been after 8 hours of continuous driving. The highway signs confirmed my odometer readings. I was passing through Macon, then Tifton, then Valdosta, following the familiar progression of Georgia cities that marked normal progress toward the Florida border. But every mile I drove seemed to stretch longer than it should, taking more time and fuel than the same distances had required during previous runs on the identical route. It was past midnight when I should have crossed into Florida, but the Welcome to Florida sign never appeared. Instead, I found myself passing through the same Georgia cities again, Valdosta, then Tifton, then Macon, as if I were driving in a giant loop, despite maintaining straight course on Interstate 75 south. The repetition was subtle at first. Highway signs and landmarks looked familiar, but I initially attributed this to the natural similarity of interstate infrastructure across long distances. Rest areas, gas stations, and highway overpasses tend to look alike, especially during night driving when visibility is limited and fatigue affects perception. But when I passed the same distinctive billboard advertising a local restaurant in Valdosta for the third time in 2 hours, I knew something was seriously wrong with either my navigation or my understanding of where I was traveling. I pulled over at the next rest area and called my dispatcher to report the navigation problems. But when I tried to describe my location, the conversation became increasingly confused. "I'm at mile marker 16 in Georgia," I told her, "but according to my time log I should be approaching Jacksonville by now." "Mile marker 16? That's near the Florida border. You should be seeing the state line any minute." That's what I thought, but I've been driving for 9 hours and I keep seeing the same cities, the same landmarks. It's like I'm driving in circles even though I'm maintaining straight course on Interstate 75. There was a long pause before she responded. "David, your GPS tracking shows you're making normal progress." You're exactly where you should be according to your schedule. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you need to take a longer break. But I wasn't experiencing fatigue or disorientation. I was alert, focused, and carefully monitoring my route and progress. The problem wasn't with my mental state, it was with the road itself, which seemed to be extending indefinitely despite my continuous southward movement. I resumed driving, determined to solve the mystery by paying closer attention to mile markers, highway signs, and distinctive landmarks that would help me track my actual progress. But the more carefully I observed, the more obvious it became that I was trapped in some kind of geographical loop that defied normal understanding of distance and direction. The same truck stop where I'd fueled up near Macon appeared again 3 hours later, complete with the same attendant who recognized my truck and asked why I was back so soon. The same construction zone that had delayed traffic near Tifton reappeared with identical orange cones and work crew vehicles, despite the fact that construction projects don't typically operate at 3 a.m. Most disturbing was the behavior of other traffic. I began to recognize specific vehicles: a red sedan with a dented rear bumper, a pickup truck with distinctive flame decals, a motorcycle with custom exhaust that created a recognizable sound signature. These same vehicles kept appearing in my mirrors and passing me at regular intervals, as if we were all trapped in the same impossible loop. The red sedan passed me for the 4th time around 4 a.m., and I decided to test my theory by attempting to communicate with the driver. I pulled alongside at a traffic light in what appeared to be Valdosta again, and rolled down my window to get the driver's attention. The woman behind the wheel looked confused and frightened when I called out to her. "Ma'am, how long have you been driving tonight?" "All night," she replied. "I'm trying to get to Jacksonville, but I keep passing the same places over and over. Do you know what's happening?" "Same thing happening to me. We're stuck in some kind of loop. The road isn't taking us where it's supposed to go." Other drivers began pulling over, and within minutes we had an impromptu meeting of confused travelers who had all experienced the same phenomenon, driving continuously south on Interstate 75, but never making progress toward our destination. Some had been driving for 12 hours, others for 6, but all of us had covered hundreds of miles without advancing beyond the same stretch of Georgia highway. A retired truck driver named Pete had the most disturbing observation. "I've been taking this route for 25 years, he said. "Know every mile marker, every overpass, every distinctive feature along the way. But tonight, the mile markers are wrong. They're counting backward and forward randomly, and some of them show numbers that don't exist on any highway system I know about." We decided to convoy together, following each other in a group, to see if collective navigation might break us out of whatever was causing the spatial distortion. But even traveling as a group, we continued to encounter the same landmarks, pass through the same cities, and make no measurable progress toward Florida, despite driving continuously south. Dawn should have provided better visibility and possibly broken whatever spell was affecting our ability to navigate normally. Instead, sunrise revealed that the landscape around Interstate 75 was subtly wrong in ways that became more obvious in daylight. The trees were too uniform in size and spacing. The topography was too flat, lacking the natural variations that characterize real Georgian terrain. The billboards advertised businesses and services that didn't quite make sense. Restaurants with names that sounded familiar but weren't quite right. Gas stations with corporate logos that were almost, but not exactly correct versions of recognized brands. We were driving through a simulation or replica of Interstate 75, a false version of the highway that mimicked the real route, while trapping travelers in an endless loop that prevented them from reaching their actual destination. The breakthrough came when Pete suggested that we try leaving the interstate entirely, abandoning our planned routes, and driving west on secondary roads, to see if we could escape whatever field or phenomenon was creating the spatial distortion. "Maybe the problem is specific to Interstate 75, he reasoned. "Maybe if we get off the highway completely, we can find roads that actually lead somewhere. We took the next exit as a group, following Pete's truck onto a state highway that led west away from the interstate. Immediately the landscape began to change and look more natural. The trees showed normal variation, the terrain had realistic topographical features, and the mile markers followed logical numerical progression. Within an hour of leaving Interstate 75, we reached a town that appeared on our maps and had normal cellular service, normal GPS reception, and residents who confirmed that we were indeed in Georgia, but much farther north than we should have been based on the time we'd spent driving. My refrigerated trailer had been running continuously for 16 hours, but according to the truck systems, I'd only covered about 200 miles of actual distance, despite burning fuel and accumulating mileage that should have taken me to Miami. The other drivers in our impromptu convoy reported similar discrepancies between time spent driving and actual distance traveled. I called my dispatcher to report the situation, but explaining what had happened was nearly impossible. How do you tell someone that a major interstate highway had trapped you in a spatial loop for an entire night? How do you document navigation problems that sound more like science fiction than mechanical malfunction? The official explanation, when I finally reached Miami 12 hours late, was that I'd experienced a series of navigation errors, compounded by fatigue and confusion. The GPS tracking data showed normal progress along Interstate 75, with no indication of unusual route deviations or extended delays. But I know what I experienced, and I know that the other drivers in our convoy experienced the same impossible phenomena. We compared notes, verified our stories, and confirmed that we'd all been trapped on a version of Interstate 75 that existed in parallel to the normal highway but led nowhere except back to itself. I've made dozens of Chicago to Miami runs since that night, always using the same road on Interstate 75, always watching for signs that the road might be developing the same spatial problems that trapped me and several other drivers for an entire night of endless driving. Most runs are completely normal, covering the expected distance in the expected time with no navigation problems or unusual phenomena. But occasionally, usually during late night hours, when traffic is light and visibility is limited, I notice subtle signs that suggest the highway isn't behaving entirely normally. Mile markers that don't follow proper numerical sequence, landmarks that appear more frequently than they should. Other drivers who look confused or frightened as they navigate roads that should be familiar but somehow aren't quite right. The endless road exists as a parallel version of Interstate 75, a trap that occasionally captures drivers and holds them in spatial loops until they abandon the highway completely and find alternate routes to their destination. Most drivers never encounter it, but those who do find themselves driving through night after night of identical landscape, burning fuel and accumulating miles without ever reaching the places they're trying to go. I still drive Interstate 75, but I carry detailed paper maps as backup navigation, maintain constant communication with dispatch, and travel with other drivers whenever possible. The endless road feeds on isolation and confusion, trapping drivers who travel alone and don't have external reference points to confirm their actual location and progress. Some highways are more than just transportation infrastructure, they're entities in their own right, creating their own geography and operating by rules that don't correspond to normal physics or cartography. The endless road is one of them, a version of Interstate 75 that offers the promise of familiar travel, while delivering only repetition and frustration to drivers who become trapped in its infinite loop. But there's always an escape route, always a way to break free from the spatial distortion by abandoning the highway completely and finding alternate paths that lead to real destination. The key is recognizing when you've entered the endless road and having the courage to leave the familiar route for uncertain secondary roads that might actually take you where you need to go. The most dangerous thing about the endless road isn't that it traps you permanently, it's that it's so similar to normal highway travel that drivers can spend hours or even days driving, without realizing they're not making real progress toward their destination. By the time the repetition becomes obvious, you've burned fuel, lost time, and missed delivery deadlines, while driving in circles on a road that exists nowhere except in the space between normal geography and impossible navigation. The Ghost Convoy: Real Stories of Truckers Who Saw Vehicles That Shouldn't Exist. From Russell. My name is Russell Patterson, and I've been driving long-haul routes across the American Southwest for 16 years, specializing in overnight runs through the desert regions of Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, where the highways stretch empty and straight for hundreds of miles between distant cities. In all those years of night driving through some of the loneliest terrain in North America, I've seen a lot of unusual things, but nothing prepared me for my encounters with the Ghost Convoy that haunts Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. The first sighting occurred on a clear October night in 2019, while I was hauling computer equipment from Phoenix to suppliers in Colorado. I'd been driving for about 6 hours, maintaining steady speed through the high desert of northern Arizona, when I noticed headlights in my mirrors that seemed unusually bright and perfectly spaced, as if they belonged to a convoy of vehicles traveling in precise formation. The lights maintained exact distance behind me for over an hour, neither gaining nor falling back, which is unusual behavior for normal highway traffic. Most drivers vary their speed naturally, creating the normal ebb and flow of vehicles passing and being passed that characterizes interstate travel, but these lights held position with mechanical precision that suggested either military convoy discipline or something else entirely. I tried to get a better look at the vehicles by adjusting my mirrors and occasionally slowing down to encourage them to pass, but the lights always maintained the same distance, never coming close enough for me to identify what type of vehicles they belonged to. In the desert darkness, all I could see were the headlight patterns, 3 sets of lights arranged in the wide spacing, typical of large trucks or commercial vehicles. Around 2 a.m., the lights began to behave in ways that defied normal traffic patterns. Instead of following the curves and grades of Interstate 40, they appeared to travel in straight lines that cut across terrain where no roads existed. When the highway curved left around a mesa, the lights continued straight across the desert, reappearing ahead of me when the road straightened out again. I was watching headlights that belonged to vehicles capable of ignoring topography and traveling across terrain that would be impossible for normal trucks to navigate. My CB radio had been quiet for most of the night, typical for late-night desert driving, where few commercial drivers operate and civilian traffic is minimal. But as the mysterious lights continued their impossible navigation, I began hearing transmissions that seemed to come from the vehicles themselves. Breaker 19, eastbound convoy, approaching mile marker 2, maintaining formation speed and interval, ETA Albuquerque unchanged. The voice was clear and professional, using standard CB protocol and terminology, but it referenced an eastbound convoy when I was the only eastbound commercial vehicle visible on that stretch of highway. The transmission couldn't be coming from the mysterious lights behind me, because those vehicles appeared to be traveling westbound, in the opposite direction. Eastbound convoy, this is Phantom Lead. Adjust interval to accommodate civilian traffic. Maintain Protocol 7 until clear of observation range. Protocol 7, that wasn't standard CB terminology or any traffic coordination system I was familiar with. But the transmissions continued, describing convoy operations and navigation procedures that sounded military or paramilitary in nature. I tried to join the conversation. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Peterbilt, at mile marker 23-4. Can you identify yourselves and your convoy operations? The response was immediate and chilling. Civilian driver, maintain current course and speed. Do not attempt direct contact or observation. Convoy operations are classified beyond your clearance level. Classified beyond my clearance level. The phrase implied that whoever was operating the mysterious convoy had knowledge of my background and security status, which should have been impossible for random travelers on But the most disturbing aspect of the transmission was that it had come through my CB radio, with perfect clarity despite the fact that I could see no vehicles anywhere ahead of me on the highway. If there was an eastbound convoy approaching mile marker 23.3, it should have been visible in the distance, especially given the excellent visibility conditions in the desert night. The lights behind me suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside my truck in the passing lane. But when I looked over to see what type of vehicles they were, I saw something that challenged my understanding of what was possible on a highway. 3 tractor trailers running in perfect formation, but they weren't quite solid. The trucks appeared to be made of light and shadow, substantial enough to cast reflections on my mirrors, but translucent enough that I could see stars through their cab windows. They were ghost vehicles, traveling at highway speeds, but existing in a state somewhere between reality and illusion. The lead truck's driver was visible in his cab, wearing what appeared to be military fatigues and a helmet with communication equipment. He turned toward me as they passed, and I saw a face that was young but somehow ancient, marked by experiences that seemed to span decades of hard travel and difficult mission. He raised his hand in a brief acknowledgement, the kind of gesture one professional driver makes to another. Then the 3 phantom trucks accelerated ahead of me and disappeared into the darkness as suddenly as they'd appeared. But their CB transmissions continued throughout the rest of my drive to Colorado. Phantom convoy passing through restricted airspace. Adjust altitude to avoid civilian radar contact. They were talking about adjusting altitude, as if the trucks were capable of vertical movement as well as horizontal travel, as if they weren't limited to highway surfaces but could navigate 3-dimensional space, like aircraft. Acknowledged. Phantom lead. Climbing to cruising altitude. Estimated crossing time for checkpoint Delta, 0347 hours. The transmissions described convoy operations that involved capabilities no earthbound vehicles could possess, but they were delivered in the matter-of-fact tones of professional drivers discussing routine logistics. Whatever the Phantom convoy was, its operators treated impossible capabilities as normal operational parameter. I've encountered the Ghost convoy 17 more times during night runs through Arizona and New Mexico, always on remote stretches of highway where few other drivers would witness their appearance. The sightings follow similar patterns: lights that maintain impossible precision, vehicles that ignore terrain limitations, CB transmissions that describe operations beyond normal transportation capabilities. But I've learned that I'm not the only driver who's encountered them. Over the years, I've collected accounts from other truckers who've had similar experiences on desert highways throughout the Southwest. Tommy Rodriguez saw them near Barstow in 2020. 3 trucks made of light, traveling in formation at about 90 miles per hour. They passed right through a mountain instead of going around it. Driver of the lead truck waved at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah Kim encountered them on Highway 50 in Nevada. They appeared in my mirrors around midnight and stayed there for 2 hours, maintaining exact distance, no matter how I varied my speed. When I pulled over for a break, they stopped too, about a quarter mile behind me. When I got back on the road, they resumed following at the same distance. Dale Morrison had the most extensive contact, driving alongside them for nearly 50 miles. Their CB chatter was constant, military terminology, reference to classified missions, discussion of operational parameters that made no sense for normal trucking. But they were professional, courteous, and helpful when I had a tire blowout. One of them actually materialized long enough to help me change the tire, then faded back into translucence. The pattern suggests that the Ghost convoy represents something more than random paranormal activity. The vehicles operate as a coordinated unit with specific missions and destinations, using highways as navigation routes, but not bound by normal physical limitations of terrain or vehicle capability. Research into the phenomenon has revealed references to similar sightings dating back to the 1970s, always involving 3 tractor trailers, always displaying military discipline and courtesy towards civilian drivers. Some accounts describe the Phantom trucks as being involved in classified transportation operations that continue even after the drivers and vehicles involved were destroyed in accidents or military action. The most credible theory, proposed by a retired military logistics officer who studied the reports, suggests that the ghost convoy represents the continuation of classified missions by personnel who died in service but remain committed to completing their assigned transportation duty. The trucks and drivers exist in a state between life and death, using supernatural capabilities to fulfill obligations that transcended their physical existence. But regardless of their origin or nature, the ghost convoy poses no threat to civilian drivers. Every encounter I've had and every account I've collected describes them as professional, helpful, and protective of normal highway traffic. They maintain safe following distances, assist drivers in distress, and provide warnings about hazardous conditions ahead. They're the spirits of professional truckers who continue to work the highways even after death, carrying cargo that may be more important than any earthbound shipment, following routes that span dimensions as well as geography, completing missions that began decades ago and may continue for decades to come. I still watch for them during night drives through the desert, listening for their CB transmissions and checking my mirrors for the distinctive light patterns that announce their presence. They've become a source of comfort during the loneliest stretches of highway, a reminder that professional drivers never truly retire from the road, even when death ends their physical careers. The ghost convoy travels the highways of the Southwest, invisible to most traffic, but visible to drivers who understand that the road carries more than just living travelers. They're proof that some commitments transcend physical existence, that some missions are too important to abandon just because the people assigned to complete them have died in service. And sometimes, when civilian drivers encounter mechanical problems or dangerous conditions on remote desert highways, the ghost convoy materializes to provide assistance that can't be explained by normal means, but which saves lives and gets stranded travelers back on the road safely. They're the guardian angels of long-haul trucking, phantom drivers who patrol the highways to ensure that no professional driver faces the dangers of the road alone, even when those dangers extend beyond mechanical breakdown into the realm of supernatural encounter and impossible navigation through terrain that exists between the physical world and whatever lies beyond. A bridge too dark. What happened when I took a shortcut the map never showed? From Thomas. My name is Thomas Chen, and I've been driving specialty transport for 11 years, carrying oversized loads that require special permits, escort vehicles, and careful route planning to avoid bridges, overpasses, and road conditions that can't accommodate non-standard freight. Last December, while hauling industrial equipment from Portland to Boise, I discovered a bridge that doesn't appear on any map, but offers a shortcut that comes with a price no freight driver should have to pay. The original route I'd planned was conservative but necessary, following major highways with confirmed clearances and load ratings that could safely handle my 90,000-pound combination of specialized drilling equipment. The shipment was bound for a mining operation in Idaho, and the delivery contract included penalties for delays that made schedule adherence critical to maintaining profitability. But weather delays in Oregon had put me 2 days behind schedule, and I was facing penalty payments that would eliminate most of the profit from the run. I needed to make up time without compromising safety or violating the routing restrictions that governed oversized load transportation. That's when I encountered Jake Morrison, a veteran driver who'd been hauling oversized freight in the Pacific Northwest for over 20 years. We met at a truck stop outside Pendleton while I was reviewing maps and trying to find legal shortcuts that might help me recover some of the lost time. Boise, huh? Jake said, looking at my route planning materials. You taking the usual path through La Grande and Baker City? That's the plan, but I'm running way behind schedule. Got any suggestions for legal shortcuts that won't violate my permit restriction? Jake studied my load specifications and permit documentation before responding. There's a route I've used a few times for time-sensitive deliveries, not marked on the commercial atlases, but it's a good road with excellent bridge rating. Cuts about 60 miles off the standard route and avoids most of the mountain passes that slow down heavy loads. He showed me a hand-drawn map that depicted a route leaving Interstate 84 near La Grande and following secondary roads through what appeared to be national forest land before rejoining the interstate system west of Boise. The route included a bridge crossing that Jake assured me was rated for loads much heavier than my equipment. The bridge was built in the 1950s for logging operations, he explained. Military-grade construction, designed to handle loaded logging trucks that weighed as much as anything on the road today. I've taken loads across it that were heavier than yours without any problem. The route looked legitimate, and Jake's experience and knowledge of Pacific Northwest transportation were well established among drivers who worked that region regularly. More importantly, the shortcut would save enough time to avoid the penalty payments that threatened to make the entire run unprofitable. I decided to follow Jake's advice. The turnoff from Interstate 84 was exactly where Jake had indicated, marked by a small green sign that read Forest Service Road 47, Industrial Access. The road surface was well-maintained gravel and dirt, suitable for heavy commercial traffic, and the grade was manageable for fully loaded trucks. But as I drove deeper into the forested mountains, I began to notice things about the route that seemed inconsistent with Jake's description. The road showed no signs of recent logging activity, no cut stumps, no equipment tracks, no evidence that the area had been used for timber operations in recent years. The forest was old growth, with trees that appeared to have been undisturbed for decades or longer. More concerning was the complete absence of other traffic. A road that connected two major highways should have shown some usage by other commercial or recreational vehicles, but I encountered no one during the 3-hour drive through increasingly remote terrain. The bridge appeared just before sunset, emerging from the forest like a monument from another era. It was a massive steel and concrete structure spanning a gorge that plunged several hundred feet into darkness below. The construction was indeed military grade, with heavy steel beams and concrete abutments that looked capable of supporting enormous weights. But the bridge was also wrong in ways that became apparent as I approached the structure more closely. The design was too advanced for 1950s construction, incorporating architectural elements and engineering principles that hadn't been developed until decades later. The steel work showed no signs of aging or weather damage despite being supposedly exposed to Pacific Northwest conditions for over 70 years. Most disturbing was the complete absence of safety railings, warning signs, or load limit postings that should have been present on any bridge carrying commercial traffic. The structure looked designed for vehicles that didn't require normal safety precautions or regulatory compliance. I should have turned around at that point, should have backtracked to the interstate and accepted the penalty payments, rather than crossing a bridge that felt fundamentally wrong despite its obvious structural integrity. But I was committed to the route, and the bridge appeared capable of handling my load safely. I started across at minimal speed, monitoring my truck's behavior and the bridge's response to the weight distribution. The structure felt solid and stable, with no vibration or deflection that would indicate stress or structural problems. My load remained secure, and the crossing proceeded smoothly for the first several hundred yards. But as I reached the midpoint of the bridge, the world around me began to change in ways that challenged basic assumptions about geography, time, and the nature of the route I was traveling. The forest on both sides of the gorge faded into darkness that was deeper than normal nightfall, as if light itself was being absorbed by something that existed beyond the normal landscape. The stars disappeared from the sky above, replaced by a void that seemed to extend infinitely upward without reference points or boundary. More unsettling was the realization that the bridge was longer than it should have been. According to my odometer, I'd already traveled over a mile across what should have been a quarter-mile span, and the far end of the structure remained hidden in darkness ahead. The bridge was extending itself as I drove, stretching across a gorge that was becoming wider and deeper with each passing moment. I tried to stop and reverse direction, But when I checked my mirrors, the approach I'd used to reach the bridge was no longer visible. Behind me was only darkness and the endless continuation of steel and concrete, spanning a void that no longer resembled any earthbound canyon or geographical feature. I was trapped on a bridge that existed in its own space and time, disconnected from the normal landscape and following rules that had nothing to do with conventional engineering or physics. My CB radio began picking up transmissions from other drivers who seemed to be in similar situations. Voices calling for help from bridges that spanned impossible distances across terrain that didn't correspond to any mapped location. Mayday, Mayday, this is eastbound Kenworth on the Cascade Bridge. I've been driving for 6 hours and I can't find the end of this structure. Fuel running low and no sign of the far side. Anyone copy this frequency? I'm on what's supposed to be a Forest Service bridge in Oregon, but it's been going on for miles and miles. The GPS shows me in the middle of empty space. This is scary, folks. Started across a bridge at sunset and it's been midnight for the past 4 hours. The sun isn't coming up and the bridge just keeps going. The transmissions confirmed that I wasn't alone in being trapped on an impossible bridge, but they also indicated that escape wasn't guaranteed. Some of the voices I heard had been broadcasting for hours or days, reporting fuel exhaustion, mechanical problems, and growing desperation as they continued driving across spans that had no end. The breakthrough came when I noticed construction equipment ahead, cranes, bulldozers, and work lights that suggested ongoing bridge building operation. As I approached the construction zone, I realized that the bridge was being built in real time, extending itself into the void as fast as vehicles could travel across it. Workers in hard hats and reflective vests directed me around equipment and obstacles, but when I tried to get their attention to ask about the situation, they ignored me completely. They were focused entirely on their construction work, building bridge sections with inhuman speed and precision. But one worker, a foreman with decades of construction experience, evident in his weathered face and confident manner, approached my truck as I waited for clearance to continue through the work zone. "First time on the Forever Bridge?" he asked. "Forever Bridge, that's what we call it. Bridge that builds itself as long as people need to cross. Started as a normal Forest Service structure back in the 50s, but something went wrong with the engineering. Instead of spanning a specific distance, it began spanning whatever distance was necessary to get people where they needed to go. How do I get off this thing? Same way everyone gets off eventually. You have to decide where you really need to go, not where you think you're supposed to go. The bridge responds to genuine need, not just planned destinations." He pointed ahead into the darkness. "Keep driving, but think about what you're really trying to accomplish with this trip. The bridge will take you there, but it might not be the destination you started toward." I continued across the endless span, but instead of focusing on my planned route to Boise, I began thinking about why I'd become a truck driver in the first place, what I was really trying to achieve through years of long-distance freight transportation. The bridge began to change as my focus shifted from external destinations to internal purposes. The steel and concrete structure gradually transformed into something that felt more like a pathway than a bridge, leading not just across geographical space, but across the conceptual distance between who I was and who I needed to become. The darkness on both sides began to show glimpses of places and times that represented significant moments in my personal and professional development. I saw the first truck I'd driven, the mentor who'd taught me the skills that made my career possible, the family I'd neglected during years of pursuing financial success through long-haul transportation. The bridge was showing me the real geography of my life, the connections and relationships that were more important than any delivery schedule or penalty payment. The exit appeared when I finally understood that some shortcuts cost more than the time they save, and that the most important destinations aren't always the ones listed on shipping manifest. The bridge delivered me not to Boise, but to a truck stop outside my hometown in California, where my ex-wife was waiting with divorce papers I'd been avoiding, and my daughter was hoping to reconcile a relationship I'd damaged through years of choosing freight over family. My load of drilling equipment disappeared somewhere during the crossing, but the delivery contract was fulfilled through methods I never understood. The mining company in Boise received their equipment on schedule, my trucking company was paid in full, and I was released from obligations that had kept me on the road for years without addressing the personal costs of constant travel. The Forever Bridge doesn't appear on any maps, because it doesn't exist in normal geographical space. It's a route between where you are and where you need to be, regardless of where you think you're going. But the crossing requires honesty about your real destinations and willingness to pay the price of genuine self-examination. I've never found Forest Service Road 47 again, despite making several attempts to locate the turnoff from Interstate. Jake Morrison, the driver who told me about the shortcut, doesn't appear in any trucking company records or driver databases. He may have been another traveler who'd crossed the Forever Bridge and was helping other drivers find the route when they needed it most. The bridge is still there, still extending itself across impossible distances, still offering shortcuts to drivers who are willing to risk discovering that their planned destinations aren't the places they really need to go. But the crossing is always one way, and the exit always leads to the place where your real journey begins, even if it's not the destination you started toward. Some bridges don't just span geographical obstacles, they span the distance between who you are and who you're meant to become. The Forever Bridge is one of them, offering passage to destinations that can't be reached by following normal routes or conventional navigation. But the toll isn't money or time, it's the willingness to abandon false destinations in favor of authentic purposes that require courage and honesty to pursue. The route that never ends. From Marcus Henley. The GPS unit mounted on my dashboard had served me faithfully for 8 years of long-haul trucking, guiding me through countless miles of interstate highways, mountain passes, and desert stretches. It was an older model, sturdy and reliable, the kind that truckers swore by before all the fancy smartphone apps took over. So when it started acting strange that foggy October night outside Bakersfield, I figured it was just time for an update or maybe a replacement. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from California's Central Valley up to Portland, running about 2 hours behind schedule due to an earlier way station delay. The fog had rolled in thick just after sunset, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. My Peterbilt's headlights carved weak tunnels through the gray soup, and I'd slowed to a cautious 40 miles per hour on what should have been a straightforward stretch of Highway 99. The screen showed a route marked in blue that would supposedly save me 40 minutes, cutting through what appeared to be a series of back roads I'd never noticed before. The alternative path wound through an area the map labeled simply as Kern County Rural Route 847, threading between hills that rose like sleeping giants in the mist. I'd been driving these California highways for the better part of a decade, and I thought I knew every shortcut and truck-friendly route from Los Angeles to the Oregon border. But the fog was getting thicker, and the promise of shaving time off my delivery schedule was tempting. The GPS recalculated the route with unusual persistence, the blue line pulsing gently on the screen as if beckoning me forward. Taking the suggested exit, I found myself on a narrow 2-lane road that seemed older than the main highway, its asphalt surface worn smooth by years of weather. The fog here was different somehow, more uniform, creating the sensation that my truck was suspended in a gray void, with only the immediate patch of road visible ahead. The usual sounds of distant traffic faded away completely, leaving only the steady rumble of my diesel engine and the soft whisper of tires on pavement. The GPS continued its quiet guidance, directing me through a series of turns that led deeper into rolling countryside. Occasionally the ghostly outline of a farmhouse or barn would materialize in the mist before vanishing again, but there were no lights in any windows, no signs of human activity. The road seemed to stretch endlessly forward, each mile looking identical to the last. After about 30 minutes of driving, I glanced at the GPS screen and noticed something odd. The blue line representing my route appeared to be longer than it had been initially, extending further into unmarked territory. The estimated time to destination, which had originally shown a savings of 40 minutes, now displayed a series of dashes where numbers should have been. I tapped the screen thinking it might be frozen, but the device responded normally, showing my truck's icon moving steadily along the blue path. I'd filled up before leaving Bakersfield and should have had nearly a full tank, but the needle showed I'd already burned through a quarter of my diesel. That seemed impossible for the distance I'd traveled, but the engine was running smoothly, showing no signs of strain or inefficiency. I made a mental note to have the fuel system checked when I reached Portland. As I continued following the GPS guidance, the road began to climb gradually into what must have been foothills, though the fog made it impossible to see the surrounding terrain. The turns became more frequent, sweeping curves that seemed to follow the contours of invisible hills. My headlights occasionally caught reflective markers along the roadside, the kind used on mountain highways, but they appeared weathered and old-fashioned, different from the modern retro-reflective signs I was accustomed to seeing. The radio, which had been playing a Portland country station, gradually faded to static. I tried scanning for other frequencies, but found nothing except the soft hiss of empty airwaves. Even the CB radio, usually alive with chatter from other truckers, remained completely silent. The isolation was becoming unsettling, though I told myself it was simply the result of driving through a rural area with poor reception. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, though my dashboard clock seemed to be behaving strangely. The digital display showed 11:47 p.m., then 11:52, then somehow jumped back to 11:40. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on my perception. But the clock continued its erratic dance, never seeming to advance past midnight, despite the subjective passage of time. The GPS remained confident in its directions, announcing upcoming turns in that same calm voice, but the route on the screen had grown into something resembling a maze. The blue line now twisted and curved across the display in patterns that defied logical road planning, creating loops and spirals that seemed to fold back on themselves. Yet the road ahead continued to appear normal, a simple two-lane highway threading through the endless fog. My fuel gauge was now showing half empty, which was genuinely concerning. I'd been driving for what felt like 3 or 4 hours since taking the detour, but that should have brought me well into Oregon by now, not deeper into some unmapped corner of Central California. I tried to remember passing any mile markers or road signs that might give me a better sense of location, but realized I hadn't seen anything of the sort since leaving the main highway. The engine temperature began climbing slightly, not into the danger zone but higher than normal for highway cruising. I reduced speed and checked the various gauges, but everything else seemed normal. The fog outside had taken on an almost luminous quality, as if lit from within by some diffuse light source I couldn't identify. It created an otherworldly atmosphere that made me feel like I was driving through clouds at high altitude, even though I was certain I was still at relatively low elevation. At first they were just glimpses in my mirrors, faint traces of headlights appearing and disappearing in the fog behind me, but as I watched more carefully, I realized there was a pattern to their movement. The lights would appear at a consistent distance, follow for a while, then vanish, only to reappear in exactly the same position a few minutes later. It was as if the same vehicle was caught in some kind of loop, forever trailing behind me through the mist. I tried adjusting my speed to get a better look at whatever was back there, slowing down to encourage it to pass, or speeding up to create more distance. But the lights maintained their constant separation, neither gaining nor falling behind, like a reflection that moved independently of its source. The CB radio crackled occasionally with what sounded like distant voices, but the words were too distorted by static to understand. The GPS screen was now showing something that couldn't possibly be accurate. The blue line had become a tangled web covering the entire display, with my truck's icon appearing to be in multiple locations simultaneously. The device continued to provide turn-by-turn directions, but they were becoming increasingly frequent and nonsensical, telling me to turn left, then immediately right, then straight ahead, as if trying to guide me through some impossible geometric space. My hands were growing stiff from gripping the steering wheel, and I realized I desperately needed to stop for a break, but there had been no truck stops, gas stations, or even wide spots in the road since I'd taken the original detour. The pavement continued its endless ribbon through the fog, offering no opportunities to pull over safely with a full-length tractor-trailer. The fuel gauge dropped to quarter full, then to the red zone, but the engine continued running smoothly. By all rights, I should have been calling for emergency fuel delivery by now, but my cell phone showed no signal, not even the single bar I might expect in a remote rural area. The device seemed to be searching constantly for towers that simply didn't exist. As what might have been dawn approached, though it was impossible to tell with the thick fog, the quality of light began to change subtly. Instead of the warm yellows and oranges of sunrise, the mist took on strange hues that shifted between green and purple, colors that had no business appearing in a natural sky. The road surface itself seemed to be evolving, changing from worn asphalt to something that looked older, more like the brick or stone highways built in the early days of automobile travel. The GPS voice had become almost hypnotic in its repetition, continuing to announce turns and maneuvers that seemed to lead nowhere new, just variations on the same endless theme of curves and straightaways through the fog. I found myself following its guidance automatically, no longer questioning the logic of the route or wondering when I might finally escape this maze of back roads. The lights behind me had multiplied, creating a convoy of phantom vehicles that appeared and disappeared in rhythm with my own movement. Sometimes I glimpsed other shapes in the fog, massive forms that might have been trucks like mine, all following their own versions of the blue line that led nowhere and everywhere at once. The weight of empty. From Marcus A. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled my Peterbilt into the Flying J truck stop just outside Bakersfield, California. It was one of those sweltering August nights where the heat seemed to rise from the asphalt in visible waves. Even at midnight, I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Portland to Los Angeles for the better part of 15 years, and I knew every truck stop, every diner, and every lonely stretch of highway between the Pacific Northwest and Southern California like the back of my weathered hand. The diesel fumes mixed with the scent of hot concrete and French fries from the attached diner created that familiar truck stop perfume that had become as much a part of my life as the constant hum of my engine. I was checking my logbook and calculating how many hours I had left before my mandatory rest period, when I noticed him standing near the fuel pumps, thumb extended toward the southbound lane of Interstate. He appeared to be in his 30s, with sandy brown hair that hung limply in the still air, and clothes that looked like they'd seen better decades. His jeans were faded to a pale blue that spoke of countless washes, and his flannel shirt bore the kind of stains that come from hard work and harder living. What struck me most, though, was his posture. He leaned heavily against a concrete post, and there was something unnatural about the way his legs seemed to end abruptly at his ankles, disappearing into what looked like well-worn work boots. Stranded motorists whose cars had broken down in the middle of nowhere, hitchhikers down on their luck, even the occasional runaway looking to start fresh somewhere new. Company policy frowned on it, but there's an unspoken code among those of us who spend our lives on the road. We look out for each other, whether we're behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, or standing on the side of the highway with our thumb in the air. There was something desperate in his gesture, a kind of weary hope that tugged at something deep in my chest. I found myself walking over to him before I'd consciously made the decision to do so. "Evening," I called out as I approached, my boots crunching on the scattered gravel that perpetually covers truck stop lots. "You looking for a ride south?" His face lit up with genuine gratitude, and I noticed his eyes were an unusual pale green, almost luminescent in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the fuel island. "Yes, sir, if you don't mind the company. I'm trying to get to Los Angeles, or as close as you're heading in that direction." "Well, you're in luck," I told him, extending my hand for a shake. "Marcus Powell, that's exactly where I'm bound, though I've got to make a quick stop in Buttonwillow first. You okay with that?" He gripped my hand firmly, and I was surprised by how cold his skin felt despite the oppressive heat. His palm was smooth, softer than I would have expected from someone whose appearance suggested manual labor. "James," he said simply. "James Morris, and I appreciate this more than you know." As we walked back toward my truck, I noticed something odd about his gait. Despite what appeared to be sturdy work boots, his footsteps made no sound on the gravel. I found myself stealing glances at his feet as we crossed the lot, but the combination of shadows and flickering neon signs from the diner made it difficult to see clearly. Still, there was something unsettling about the way he seemed to glide rather than walk, as if he were floating just slightly above the ground. I helped him up into the passenger seat, and he settled in with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. The interior of my cab was my home away from home, decorated with family photos, a small collection of classic country CDs, and the various creature comforts that make those long hauls bearable. Air fresheners shaped like pine trees hung from the rearview mirror, and a small cooler behind my seat held sandwiches and cold drinks for the journey. "Comfortable?" I asked as I fired up the engine, feeling the familiar vibration as the diesel motor rumbled to life. The dashboard lights cast a warm amber glow throughout the cab, and the air conditioning began its blessed work of pushing back against the California heat. "Very much so," James replied, though I noticed he kept his legs positioned carefully, his feet tucked back under the seat in a way that seemed almost defensive. "It's been a long time since I've been in such a nice rig." As we pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the interstate, I tried to make conversation the way I always did with hitchhikers. Most folks had stories, reasons for being on the road, destinations that meant something to them. "So what takes you to Los Angeles?" I asked, adjusting my mirrors and settling into the rhythm of highway driving. "Family business," he answered after a long pause. "Something I should have taken care of a long time ago." There was a finality in his voice that suggested he didn't want to elaborate, so I let the matter drop. The highway stretched out before us like a ribbon of black glass, broken only by the occasional sweep of oncoming headlights. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night DJ spinning classic rock and taking calls from insomniacs and third-shift workers across the Central Valley. It was perhaps 20 minutes into our journey when I first noticed the smell. It started as something subtle, almost pleasant, like the scent of autumn leaves, but gradually it grew stronger and more complex, taking on notes of damp earth and something indefinably organic. I glanced over at James, wondering if he noticed it too, but his attention seemed focused entirely on the landscape rolling past his window. "I'm fine," he replied, but his voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were speaking from very far away. "Just thinking about old times." The miles rolled by in relative quiet, broken only by the steady hum of tires on asphalt, and the occasional squawk from other drivers on the CB radio. I found myself stealing glances at my passenger, trying to figure out what it was about him that sat uneasily in the back of my mind. He sat perfectly still, almost unnaturally so, his hands folded in his lap, and his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Most hitchhikers fidgeted, made small talk, or dozed off during long rides, but James remained as motionless as a statue. It was when we hit a particularly bright stretch of highway, illuminated by a series of overhead lights near a rest area, that I finally saw what had been nagging at me. As the light flooded the cab, I looked down and felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. James's work boots, which I had noticed when he first climbed into the cab, appeared to be completely empty. They sat flat against the floor of the truck, as if no feet occupied them at all. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion created by shadows and exhaustion, but as we passed under lamp after lamp, the truth became undeniable. My passenger had no feet, his legs ended abruptly at his ankles, and his boots were nothing more than props. Empty leather shells that maintained the illusion of normal human anatomy. Every instinct screamed at me to pull over, to demand an explanation, to somehow get this impossible man out of my truck. But a deeper, more primal fear kept me driving. What kind of person travels without feet? What kind of thing appears human, but lacks such fundamental anatomy? Is everything all right, Marcus? James asked, and I realized I had been holding my breath. His voice carried the same calm tone as before, but now it seemed to echo strangely in the confined space of the cab, as if coming from someplace much larger and more hollow than a truck's interior. "Fine," I managed to croak out. "Just tired, I guess." "Driving at night can play tricks on your mind," he said, and I caught him looking at me with those pale green eyes. "Sometimes we see things that aren't really there. Sometimes we don't see things that are." The smell had grown stronger, now unmistakably the scent of freshly turned grave dirt, mixed with something sweet and putrid. I rolled down my window slightly, desperate for fresh air, but the hot night wind that rushed in only seemed to make the odor more concentrated. "James," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." Of course, the only sounds were the rumbling of the engine. The lingering smoke from Marcus Chen, the Interstate 80 rest stop, appeared through my rain-streaked windshield like a beacon in the Nebraska darkness, its fluorescent lights casting pale halos in the October mist. I'd been pushing my Peterbilt 389 for 12 straight hours, hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, and my eyelids felt heavy as the steel I'd carried on previous runs. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and the coffee from my last stop had long since worn off, leaving me with that familiar hollow feeling that only long-haul truckers truly understand. As I downshifted and guided my rig into the truck parking area, the first thing that struck me wasn't the usual diesel fumes or the scent of cooling asphalt after rain. Instead, my nostrils filled with the distinct aroma of wood smoke, thick and pervasive, as if someone had been burning logs in a fireplace for hours. It seemed odd for a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, especially one that looked as modern as this facility with its angular concrete buildings and LED lighting. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the night air flow into my cab, and the smoke smell only grew stronger, carrying with it an undertone of something else. Something I couldn't quite identify, but that made my stomach tighten with an inexplicable unease. The parking lot held only 3 other trucks, their drivers likely catching a few hours of mandatory rest, their cabs dark and silent. My air brakes hissed as I settled into a spot near the far end of the lot, wanting to give myself plenty of room for the morning departure. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, creating tiny rivers that meandered across the windshield, distorting the lights of the rest stop building into abstract watercolor smear. I sat in my driver's seat for a moment, engine idling, listening to the familiar rumble that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over my 15 years of driving these highways. The smoke smell seemed to be growing stronger rather than dissipating, and when I looked toward the main building, I noticed that the windows appeared oddly dark despite the bright exterior lighting. Most rest stops kept their interiors well lit around the clock, both for security and to welcome weary travelers, but this building seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The vending machines outside glowed with their usual commercial brightness, humming quietly in the night, but they only made the darkness of the building's windows more pronounced. I shut down my engine and climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing softly in the shallow puddles that dotted the asphalt. The smoke smell immediately intensified, filling my lungs with each breath, and I found myself coughing slightly, though I couldn't see any visible source of the smoke anywhere around the facility. The air felt thick, almost chewy, and carried a weight that seemed to press against my chest. I'd encountered brush fires during my travels, had driven through areas where controlled burns were taking place, but this smoke felt different, older somehow, as if it had been hanging in the air for decades rather than hours. Walking toward the main building, I noticed that my footsteps seemed unusually loud against the wet pavement, echoing off the concrete walls with a hollowness that made me feel suddenly isolated despite being at a public facility. The automatic doors slid open as I approached, revealing an interior that was indeed dimly lit, with only every third fluorescent fixture functioning, creating pools of pale light separated by stretches of shadow. The remaining lights flickered occasionally, casting moving shadows that seemed to shift and dance independently of any visible cause. The building's interior carried the smoke smell even more intensely, and I had to pause just inside the entrance to let my lungs adjust. The facility appeared to be older than I'd initially thought, with tile floors that showed years of wear and walls that bore the subtle discoloration of age. An information kiosk stood near the entrance, its brochures for local attractions looking faded and outdated, some appearing to advertise businesses and landmarks that seemed decades out of date. The restroom doors stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond, though I could hear the steady drip of water from somewhere within. Behind the service counter, which appeared to be unmanned at this hour, I noticed a collection of items that seemed oddly personal for a rest stop. Old coffee mugs with names written in marker, a small radio that played softly with music that sounded like it came from another era, and several photographs taped to the wall showing groups of people in clothing styles that suggested they were taken many years ago. The people in the photos were smiling, but something about their expressions seemed forced, as if they were trying to appear happy despite some underlying concern or fear. As I made my way toward the restrooms, the smoke smell began to take on that additional undertone I'd noticed earlier, and I finally recognized what it was: the scent of burning fabric, specifically the kind of synthetic materials used in clothing and upholstery. It was a smell I remembered from a house fire in my neighborhood when I was a child, acrid and unpleasant, carrying with it implications of loss and destruction that made my throat constrict with more than just the physical irritation of the smoke. The men's restroom was functional but felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The mirrors were clean but seemed to reflect the flickering lights more than they should, creating an almost strobe-like effect that made it difficult to focus on my own reflection. The paper towel dispensers were the old mechanical kind that required pulling down on the towels, and they squeaked with each use, the sound seeming to hang in the air longer than it should. Most unsettling was the fact that the smoke smell was strongest in here, as if its source was somehow connected to the building's plumbing or ventilation system. When I emerged from the restroom, I decided to investigate the vending machine area, hoping to grab a coffee and perhaps a snack for the road. The machines hummed quietly, their internal lights revealing the usual array of sodas, energy drinks, sandwiches, and candy bars, but several of the products appeared to be brands I hadn't seen in years, packaging designs that looked distinctly vintage. The coffee machine accepted my dollar bills readily enough, but the coffee that emerged was darker than I expected, almost black, and carried the smoke smell so strongly that I wondered if something was wrong with the machine's heating element. As I stood sipping the bitter coffee, trying to decide whether it was worth drinking or if I should pour it out and look for caffeine elsewhere, I became aware of a sound coming from deeper within the building, a low murmuring that might have been voices, but was too indistinct to understand. The sound seemed to be coming from an area behind the main service counter, possibly an employee break room or office space that wasn't visible to the public. What made it particularly unsettling was that it didn't sound like the kind of casual conversation you'd expect from workers on a night shift, but rather like multiple people speaking in hushed, urgent tones, as if discussing something of great importance or concern. The smoke smell continued to intensify, and I began to notice that it wasn't just the scent of burning materials, but something more complex and disturbing. There were undertones that reminded me of the smell of overheated electronics, the particular odor that comes from circuits and components pushed beyond their limits. And beneath that, something organic and unpleasant that I didn't want to identify too closely. The combination created an olfactory experience that was not just unpleasant, but actively alarming, triggering some primitive instinct that suggested immediate danger. I stood before them for several seconds, waving my arms and stepping closer to the sensors, but they remained stubbornly closed. The murmuring from the back area of the building seemed to grow slightly louder, and I thought I could make out individual words, though they didn't seem to be in English. Or if they were spoken in such heavy accents or dialects that they were incomprehensible to me. Finally, the doors slid open with a mechanical grinding sound that suggested they were in need of maintenance, and I stepped quickly into the night air, grateful to escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the building's interior. But outside, the smoke smell was stronger than ever, and I could see that a thin haze had settled over the parking lot, visible in the glow of the lights like a fine fog. My truck seemed farther away than I remembered, and as I walked toward it, I noticed that the other vehicles in the lot appeared to be older models than I'd initially observed, as if they'd been sitting here for years rather than hours. When I reached my Peterbilt, I found that the exterior was covered with a fine layer of what looked like ash, dark specks that clung to the paint and chrome despite the recent rain. I ran my finger across the hood, and the ash came away easily, leaving a clean streak that revealed just how much of the stuff had accumulated. The voice that wouldn't stop, from Jake Morrison. The CB radio in my Peterbilt had been acting up for weeks, crackling with static whenever I hit certain stretches of highway, picking up fragments of conversations from truckers hundreds of miles away. Sometimes I'd catch snippets of weather reports from states I wouldn't reach for days, or the tail end of someone's story about a roadside diner that served the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi. It was the kind of harmless interference that comes with driving the lonelier routes, where radio waves bounce off mountains and skip across valleys in ways that would make an engineer scratch his head. I was hauling a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, taking the scenic route through Colorado because the dispatcher had given me extra time, and the autumn colors were worth the detour. The mountains rose around me like sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with early snow that caught the last rays of afternoon sunlight. My rig hummed contentedly along the winding highway, 18 wheels eating up the miles with the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my life over the past 15 years. The CB had been quiet for most of the day, just the occasional check-in from other drivers, and the standard chatter about speed traps and construction zones. But as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took my breath away, I started hearing something else. At first I thought it was just another case of crossed signals or atmospheric interference, because all I could make out was a single word, repeated at irregular intervals with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested a radio stuck on transmit. The voice was clear and distinct, cutting through the static with an urgency that made me check my mirrors and scan the road ahead for any signs of trouble. It wasn't the usual trucker lingo, or the casual conversation of drivers passing time on long haul. This was different, stripped down to its most essential element, carrying a weight that seemed to press against my chest as I listened. I reached for the handset and tried to respond, clicking through the channels to see if I could locate the source of the transmission. Channel 19 was clear except for the distant murmur of a weather report. Channel 17 carried the usual back and forth between a pair of drivers, discussing the merits of different truck stops. But on Channel 21, there it was again, that single word cutting through the static like a knife through silence. Stop. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something in between that defied easy categorization. It carried an authority that made me want to comply, even though I had no idea what I was supposed to stop doing. I tried keying the mic asking if the driver needed assistance, but there was no response except for that steady repetition. Stop. Stop. The word came every 15 or 20 seconds, never varying in tone or inflection, never accompanied by any other sound that might give me a clue about its origin. No engine noise in the background, no road sounds, no indication that it was coming from another truck at all. Just that voice, hanging in the air like a question mark made of sound. The highway began to descend through a series of switchbacks that demanded my full attention, and I turned down the volume on the CB while I navigated the twisting curves. The mountains pressed close on both sides, their slopes covered in aspen trees that had turned brilliant gold, creating a corridor of light that seemed to glow from within. My headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating the center line that snaked ahead of me like a yellow ribbon threading through the wilderness. When I reached the bottom of the grade and the road straightened out again, I turned the CB back up, half hoping that the mysterious transmission had moved on to bother someone else. But it was still there, patient and persistent, marking time with mechanical regularity. Stop, stop. I found myself counting the intervals, trying to detect some pattern or variation that might explain what I was hearing. Sometimes the pauses were longer, sometimes shorter, but the word itself never changed, never wavered, never gave any indication that there was a human being behind it. The fuel gauge showed I had enough diesel to reach Grand Junction, but something about that voice made me want to get off the highway, to find a well-lit truck stop with other drivers around, and wait until morning to continue my journey. It was an irrational impulse, the kind of gut feeling that experienced drivers learn to trust, even when they can't explain it. The voice wasn't threatening, exactly, but it carried an undercurrent of urgency that seemed to grow stronger as darkness settled over the mountain. I spotted a sign for a rest area 5 miles ahead, and decided to pull over, thinking that maybe I could use the higher elevation to get a better fix on where the transmission was coming from. The rest area turned out to be little more than a paved loop, with a few picnic tables and a pair of vault toilets, but it offered a panoramic view of the valley below, where I could see the lights of a small town twinkling like scattered stars. I pulled the rig to a stop at the far end of the loop, set the air brakes, and climbed down to stretch my legs. The mountain air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. Above me, the first stars were beginning to appear in a sky that had deepened from purple to black, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic on the highway below, the Doppler shift of engines climbing and descending through the curve. Back in the cab, I tried working through the CB channels again, hoping to make contact with the source of that mysterious voice. Channel after channel yielded nothing but static or empty air, until I reached 21 again and heard it, clearer than ever. Stop. The word seemed to hang in the air longer this time, and I thought I detected something else in the background, a sound so faint it might have been my imagination. Wind, maybe, or the whisper of tires on pavement, or something else entirely that my mind couldn't quite categorize. I keyed the microphone and tried again. This is the westbound Peterbilt at mile marker 147. Trying to reach the station transmitting on channel 21. Do you cop? The question hung in the air for a moment, followed by the familiar crackle of static, and then that voice again, unchanged and unchanging. Stop, stop, stop. I'd been driving trucks for long enough to hear all kinds of strange things on the CB, from the lonely ramblings of sleepless drivers, to the elaborate pranks that bored teenagers sometimes played on unsuspecting truckers. But this was different, carrying a quality that seemed to bypass my rational mind and speak directly to some deeper part of my consciousness, the part that had kept our ancestors alive in a world full of predators and hidden dangers. I decided to change channels, to find some normal conversation to wash away the taste of that mysterious transmission. Channel 19 was busy with a discussion about road conditions ahead, and I joined in, giving my location and asking about weather reports for the Phoenix area. The familiar rhythms of trucker conversation helped settle my nerves, and I began to think I was overreacting to what was probably just some kind of technical malfunction or elaborate joke. But when I went back to channel 21, the voice was still there, still speaking that single word with mechanical precision. Stop, stop. And now I was certain I could hear something else in the background, a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was distant and indistinct, but it sounded like crying, like someone in distress trying to call for help through a transmission that would only carry one word. I grabbed my atlas and spread it across the passenger seat, trying to figure out exactly where I was and what other roads might be in range of my CB. The rest area was marked on the map, perched on a ridge that offered line-of-sight transmission for miles in every direction. Below me, several smaller roads branched off from the main highway, winding deeper into the mountains toward abandoned mining camps and forgotten settlements that existed now only as names on topographical maps. The sound of an approaching engine made me look up from the atlas, and I saw a pair of headlights climbing the access road to the rest area. Another truck by the sound of it, downshifting as it negotiated the steep grade. I felt a wave of relief at the prospect of company, someone else to listen to that strange transmission and tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The driver climbed down and walked over to my rig, a tall figure silhouetted against his headlights. I rolled down the window as he approached, grateful for the interruption. "Saw your running lights from down on the highway. Everything all right up here?" "Yeah, mostly," I replied, then hesitated. "How do you explain that you're being spooked by a CB transmission?" "The pendulum's pull." From Jake Morrison. The trailer shouldn't have been moving. Not even a whisper of wind stirred the tall grass along Highway 62 that October night. Yet there it hung behind my Peterbilt, swaying back and forth like a slow metronome, counting down to something I couldn't name. I'd been driving cross-country freight for nearly 2 decades, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment, but I'd never seen cargo behave like this. The load was supposed to be simple enough. 3 antique grandfather clocks, each one wrapped and secured in my 40-foot dry van, destination Phoenix. The shipper in Vermont had seemed nervous when we loaded them, kept muttering about how they'd been in storage for 30 years and how the new owner was finally ready for them. His hands shook as he signed the bill of lading, and when I asked about the special handling instructions, he just said to keep them upright and drive steady. Nothing I hadn't done 1,000 times before. But now, 6 hours into the night drive, something was wrong. Every time I caught a glimpse of the trailer in my side mirrors, it was moving. Not the normal road sway you'd expect from a loaded trailer catching crosswinds or riding rough pavement. This was different, deliberate, a gentle rhythmic swing from left to right and back again, as if something inside was shifting with its own internal timing. I pulled into a truck stop outside Harrisburg to check the load. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few other rigs, lined up under the harsh sodium lights, their drivers either sleeping or grabbing coffee in the attached diner. The silence was absolute, not even the distant hum of highway traffic to break the stillness. I walked slowly around the trailer, looking for any sign of what might be causing the movement. The doors were still sealed, the locks intact. No visible damage to the suspension or axle. Everything appeared normal, yet as I stood there watching, the trailer gave another gentle sway, rocking on its air suspension, like a boat at anchor. The hair on my arms stood up as I realized there wasn't so much as a breath of air moving through the parking lot. The truck stop's flags hung limp against their poles. Even the paper coffee cups someone had dropped near the fuel pumps lay motionless on the asphalt. Yet my trailer continued its slow, hypnotic dance. I climbed back into the cab, telling myself it had to be the load settling, maybe one of the clocks shifting despite the strapping. But grandfather clocks are heavy, solid things, not prone to movement once properly secured. Still, I called the shipper's emergency number, letting it ring until voicemail picked up. His recorded voice sounded different somehow, strained, as if he'd been holding his breath while leaving the message. Mile after mile through Pennsylvania's rolling hills, I could see it in my mirrors whenever I passed under the glow of overhead lights. The rhythm never changed, never stopped, just that endless pendulum motion that seemed to mock the stillness of the night air around it. Other trucks I passed sat stable on their suspensions, their trailers tracking straight and true behind them. Only mine moved with that strange, internal cadence. Somewhere past Pittsburgh, I started hearing it. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking of the trailer frame, the kind of settling noise any freight hauler learns to ignore. But as the night wore on, the sound became more distinct. It was a low, resonant tick, barely audible above the diesel engine's rumble, but constant as a heartbeat. Tick, pause, tick, pause. Perfectly synchronized with the trailer's swing. I tried turning up the radio, but every station seemed to fade into static after a few minutes. The CB radio was equally useless, just empty channels, and the occasional burst of distant conversation that cut out whenever I tried to respond. The isolation was complete, just me and the highway and whatever was making my cargo dance in the windless night. Rest areas along the interstate offered no relief. Each time I pulled over to check the load again, the swaying would continue even after I'd shut down the engine and set the air brakes. The silence in these stops was profound, almost oppressive, yet the trailer moved with increasing determination, as if whatever force drove it was growing stronger with each passing hour. A state trooper found me at a rest stop outside Columbus, standing beside my trailer with a flashlight, once again examining every chain, every strap, every possible explanation for what I was experiencing. He was young, probably new to the night shift, and he approached with the careful politeness of someone who dealt with plenty of sleep-deprived truckers, claiming to see things that weren't there. Got a call about a truck parked here for a while. Deke. I tried to explain about the swaying, about the sound, about how the trailer moved even when there wasn't a hint of wind. He listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism growing in his eye. To him, it probably looked like just another rig parked for a mandatory rest break, stable and normal under the harsh LED lights of the rest area. As if on cue, the trailer gave one of its gentle sways, and I pointed triumphantly at the movement. The trooper frowned, studying the suspension, but seemed to attribute it to normal settling. He couldn't hear what I was hearing, couldn't sense the wrongness that had been building all night. After he left, satisfied that I wasn't an immediate danger to anyone, I sat in the cab and tried to think rationally about what was happening. The ticking had grown louder, no longer masked by the engine noise even when we were rolling. It filled the cab now, a steady rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the cargo area directly behind my sleeper. 3 grandfather clocks, the shipper had said. Antiques. In storage for 30 years, grandfather clocks don't tick when they're shut down for transport. The pendulums are secured, the weights removed, the movements carefully prepared for shipping. They're essentially silent until someone sets them up and starts them running again. Yet the sound coming from my trailer was unmistakably the tick of clockwork, not just one timepiece, but multiple mechanisms running in perfect synchronization. I called the consignee in Phoenix, waking him from what sounded like a deep sleep. His voice was groggy at first, but when I explained about the movement and the sound, he became instantly alert. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his words chilled me more than the October night air, seeping through the cab's windows. The seller promised me they'd stay dormant until I could perform the proper setup. This complicates things considerably. When I asked him what he meant, he simply said he'd meet me at the delivery point and hung up, leaving me alone with more questions than answers and a cargo that was becoming more active by the hour. The swaying had intensified as we crossed into Missouri. What had started as a gentle rocking motion was now a pronounced pendulum swing that I could feel through the entire truck. Other drivers on the interstate began giving me wide berth, probably assuming I had an unstable load or was fighting crosswinds they couldn't detect. The CB radio crackled occasionally with voices commenting on the dancing trailer they'd spotted, but when I tried to respond, the signal would dissolve into static. Dawn was still hours away when I noticed the truck's handling had changed. The normally smooth ride of my Peterbilt had developed a strange rhythm, as if the trailer's movement was actually pulling the tractor unit along with it. I had to constantly correct the steering to maintain a straight line, fighting against some invisible force that wanted to draw us in sweeping arcs across the highway. The ticking had evolved too, no longer a simple rhythmic pulse, but a complex pattern of overlapping sound. 3 distinct clockwork voices now counted time in the darkness behind me, sometimes in unison, sometimes in a cascading sequence that reminded me of church bells. The sound was so clear now that I was certain anyone outside the truck would hear it, yet when I'd asked the state trooper earlier, he'd looked at me as if I were speaking in tongues. Each time I slowed down, the trailer's swaying would become so violent that I feared it might actually overturn, despite the low center of gravity that should have kept it stable. The only solution was to keep moving, to maintain highway speed, and hope that whatever force had awakened in my cargo would remain manageable until I could reach Phoenix and hand over this increasingly supernatural burden. The night stretched endlessly ahead, marked not by mile markers or exit signs, but by the steadily increasing intensity of the phenomena plaguing my rig. The trailer now swayed so dramatically that I could see the movement even in my peripheral vision, a constant reminder that natural laws seemed to have abandoned this particular corner of the transportation industry. The voice behind the static. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that after a while, the dispatchers become more familiar to you than your own family. You hear their voices cutting through the static at 2 in the morning, guiding you down forgotten highways and through industrial complexes that smell of diesel and rain. Most drivers have their favorites, the ones with smooth voices who know every truck stop between Denver and Dallas, who remember your coffee preferences and ask about your dog back home. But there was one dispatcher I'll never forget, though not for any comfortable reason. Her name was Carol, and she worked the overnight shift out of the central hub in Kansas City. I'd been pulling freight for Midwest Transport for about 3 years when I first heard her voice crackling through my CB radio on a humid September night. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Phoenix, running behind schedule because of construction delays outside Springfield. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning my windshield into a liquid kaleidoscope of truck stop neon and distant lightning. Carol's voice was different from the other dispatchers, where most of them spoke with that practiced telekinesis clarity. Hers had an odd quality to it, like she was speaking through water or from the bottom of a deep well. The words came out slightly slurred, not drunk exactly, but as if her mouth wasn't quite forming the consonants properly. At first I figured she might have a speech impediment or maybe dental work that was affecting her pronunciation. Unit 774. This is dispatch. Her voice warbled through the static that night. You copy?
Dear.
Copy. Dispatch. This is Marcus, in 774. Want you to take exit 192 and follow County Road 18 through Millfield. Should save you 2 hours, maybe 3. I glanced at my GPS, frowning. The suggested route would indeed bypass the congestion, but it would take me through some pretty desolate country. Still, Carol had always steered me right before, and losing 3 hours to traffic would put me seriously behind schedule. Good, Carol's distorted voice replied, and there was something in her tone that made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Drive safe out there, Marcus. Real safe. The county road wound through farmland that stretched endlessly in both directions, cornfields swaying in the wind like dark ocean waves. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating rain-slicked asphalt and the occasional reflective eyes of some animal watching from the roadside. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar rhythm, a comforting constant in the increasing isolation. After about an hour on County 18, Carol's voice crackled through again, though this time the static was worse, making her already unclear speech even more difficult to understand. 774, you still out there? Thanks for the tip. Oh, that's real good, Marcus. Real good to hear. There was a pause, filled with the hiss and pop of radio interference. Tell me you see any other trucks out there? Any other traveler? I scanned the darkness ahead and behind me. The road had been completely empty since I'd left the interstate. No truck stops, no gas stations, just endless farmland and the occasional abandoned barn silhouetted against the storm clouds. Negative dispatch. Road's pretty quiet out here. Quiet, she repeated, and there was something almost hungry in the way she said it. That's perfect, just perfect. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of rain hammering my roof and the steady thrum of the diesel engine. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach like a cold meal. Carol had always been a bit odd, but something about her voice tonight seemed different, more distorted than usual. About 20 minutes later, I crested a small hill and saw lights ahead. Not the warm yellow glow of a town, but the harsh white illumination of what looked like a truck inspection station. As I drew closer, I could make out a small building with a few official-looking vehicles parked outside. A sign by the roadside read, Department of Transportation mandatory inspection. I keyed my radio. Dispatch. This is 774. Got an inspection station ahead. Wasn't expecting any DOT checks out here. The response came immediately. Carol's voice clearer now, though still carrying that underwater quality. Oh yes, Marcus. Yes, you'll want to stop there. Very important that you stop. They're waiting for you. Something in her tone made my skin crawl. I slowed the truck, studying the inspection station more carefully. The building looked new, but there was something off about it. The windows were too dark, and despite the official vehicles, I couldn't see any movement or signs of life. Copy, dispatch. Though I have to say, this seems like an odd place for an inspection station. Middle of nowhere and all. Carol's laugh came through the radio, a sound like breaking glass mixed with static. Oh, Marcus. Sweet Marcus. Not everything is what it seems out here on the lonely road. Not everything at all. I was close enough now to read the license plates on the official vehicles, and my blood went cold. They were all the same number, repeated exactly. DOT 000. The building's door hung slightly open, darkness spilling out like thick syrup. No lights showed in any of the windows despite the harsh exterior illumination. Carol's voice had changed again, becoming more distorted, the words stretching and warping as if played on a broken tape machine. What's not right, Marcus, is drivers who don't follow instructions, drivers who ask too many questions. I pressed harder on the accelerator, deciding to blow past the inspection station. As my truck picked up speed, the building's exterior lights began to flicker, strobing in a pattern that hurt to look at. The official vehicles started moving, but not like normal cars starting up. They slid across the parking lot without their engines running, as if pulled by invisible strings. 774, you need to stop. Carol's voice crackled through the radio, now so distorted it barely sounded human. The words came out slurred and wet, as if she were speaking through a mouthful of blood. You need to stop right now. They cow. Like hell I do. I muttered, pushing my Peterbilt to its limits on the narrow county road. In my mirrors I could see the inspection station receding, but the official vehicles had somehow made it to the road, and were following, their headlights weaving back and forth like searching eyes. Marcus. Carol's voice came again, and this time I could hear something else in the background, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on metal, or teeth chattering. You're making this very difficult, very unpleasant. The pursuing vehicles were gaining on me impossibly fast, considering I was pushing 70 on a road that should have limited them to half that speed. Worse, they were moving in formation, boxing me in from behind and both sides. I grabbed my CB handset, switching to the emergency channel. Mayday, mayday. This is Unit 774 on County Road 18. I'm being pursued by unknown vehicles claiming to be DOT. Need immediate assistance. The response that came back was Carol's voice, but now it sounded like it was coming from multiple radios at once, creating an echo effect that made my teeth ache. No one can help you out here, Marcus. No one even knows this road exists anymore. It's just you and me, and these lovely, lonely miles. Just ahead I spotted a side road branching off to the right. Without signaling or slowing down properly, I yanked the wheel hard over, feeling the trailer fishtail behind me as I fought to maintain control. The turn was too sharp for my speed, and for a terrifying moment I thought I was going to jackknife. But somehow I managed to straighten out on what appeared to be an old farm access road. Behind me, the pursuing vehicles had overshot the turn, and I watched in my mirrors as they tried to reverse. But instead of backing up normally, they seemed to slide backward, still maintaining that unnatural mechanical movement that defied physics. The farm road was narrow and rutted, forcing me to slow down considerably. My headlights revealed abandoned silos and collapsed barns, the remnants of agricultural dreams left to rot in the endless Kansas night. The rain had intensified, turning the unpaved sections of road into muddy soup that threatened to bog down my 18-wheeler. Where are you going, Marcus? Carol's voice drifted through the radio, now sounding almost conversational despite its grotesque distortion. The stillness between seconds, From Marcus Chen. Set. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour when I first spotted the neon glow cutting through the December fog like a lighthouse beacon in an ocean of gray. Interstate 94 stretched endlessly ahead of my Peterbilt, its familiar rumble the only constant companion I'd had since leaving Minneapolis 3 days behind schedule. The load of auto parts bound for Detroit should have been delivered yesterday, but a series of mechanical delays and weather setbacks had left me pushing harder than I liked, chasing lost time through the frozen arteries of the Midwest. The fuel gauge needle had been flirting with the red zone for 20 miles, and my eyelids felt heavy as lead weights, despite the thermos of coffee growing cold in the cup holder. When that pale blue sign emerged from the Merck advertising Mel's 24-hour truck plaza, it felt like salvation wrapped in weathered aluminum siding and promises of diesel fuel. The exit ramp curved away from the interstate like a question mark, leading down into a shallow valley where the fog seemed to pool and thicken, transforming the world into something soft and dreamlike. As I downshifted and felt the air brakes hiss their familiar sigh, the truck plaza materialized from the mist like a ship emerging from fog. The main building sat squat and solid under a constellation of buzzing neon signs, their electric blues and reds painting the parking lot in patches of color that seemed almost too vivid against the monochrome night. A handful of semis dotted the expanses of asphalt like sleeping giants, their running lights creating small pools of amber warmth in the darkness. The whole scene had an oddly timeless quality, as if it had been plucked from some idealized memory of what truck stops were supposed to look like. I guided the Peterbilt toward the fuel island, noting how my headlights seemed to struggle against the fog, their beams diffusing into soft cones that barely penetrated the gloom. The diesel pumps stood in neat rows like mechanical sentinels, their digital displays glowing with that particular shade of green that always reminded me of old computer terminal. As I rolled to a stop beside pump number 7, I became aware of something unusual in the quality of the silence that settled around my truck. The engine's rumble faded to its idle purr, but there was something else missing, something I couldn't quite identify at first. Then it hit me: there was no wind. The fog hung perfectly still, not drifting or swirling as fog should, but suspended in the air like a painted backdrop. Even the neon signs seemed frozen in their cycling patterns, locked in tableau of electric color that should have been shifting and changing but remained constant as constellation. I climbed down from the cab, my boots connecting with asphalt that felt strangely solid, almost unnaturally so, as if the ground itself had been crystallized. The fuel nozzle came away from its cradle with the usual mechanical chunk, and I began the familiar ritual of filling the tank, watching the numbers on the display climb with their steady digital progression. But something was wrong with the rhythm. The gallons were ticking by, but they seemed to be doing so in a pattern that was just slightly off, like a clock that ran a fraction too slow. There was a man in a red flannel shirt standing beside a blue Kenworth, about 50 feet away, his hand frozen in the act of reaching for his fuel cap. His posture was natural enough, but he had been in exactly that position when I first arrived, and he remained there now, motionless as a photograph. Closer to the main building, a woman in a yellow safety vest stood with one foot on the step of her rig, caught in the middle of climbing down, her expression pleasant but utterly static. The fuel pump clicked off with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the still air. I replaced the nozzle and walked slowly toward the main building, my footsteps the only sound in a world that had apparently forgotten how to make noise. The fog swirled around my legs as I moved, the only thing that seemed to respond to motion, but even it moved wrong, too slowly, like honey dripping from a spoon. Inside the truck stop, the fluorescent lights hummed with their usual electric buzz, but the sound was constant, without the subtle variations that should accompany such lighting. Behind the counter, a clerk in a blue polo shirt stood with his hand extended toward a customer, a credit card suspended in the air between them, like a magic trick frozen in amber. The customer, a heavy-set man in denims and work boots, smiled that particular smile of tired friendliness that passes between strangers in the small hours of the morning, but the expression never wavered, never changed. It was solid real, but when I tried to move it, it resisted as if it were part of some invisible sculpture. The plastic was warm to the touch, and I could feel the subtle texture of the printed numbers, but it would not budge from its position in space. The entire scene was like a museum diorama of truck stop life, perfectly preserved, but utterly lifeless. I called out, my voice sounding flat and somehow smaller than usual, but neither the clerk nor the customer responded. Their eyes remained fixed on their eternal transaction, trapped in a moment that had stretched beyond its natural boundary. I backed toward the door, my skin prickling with the kind of unease that comes from being watched, though the watching eyes were locked in their glassy stare and could not follow my movement. Outside, the fog had thickened, creating walls of gray that seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence. My truck sat where I had left it, the only thing that looked natural and alive in this tableau of suspended animation. But as I approached the Peterbilt, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The fuel gauge, which should have read full after my recent fill-up, showed exactly the same level it had when I arrived. The numbers on my dashboard clock hadn't changed either. According to the glowing digits, it was still 2:47 a.m., the exact time I had pulled into the truck plaza. I climbed into the cab and turned the key, desperate to hear the engine's familiar roar, to feel its vibrations beneath me. The Peterbilt responded, but even the engine sound seemed wrong, muffled and distant despite originating from directly beneath my seat. I put the truck in gear and began to roll forward, watching the other vehicles pass like monuments to mobility frozen in place. The fog seemed to resist my progress, growing thicker as I approached what should have been the exit. The beam of my headlights struck what looked like a wall of gray cotton, impenetrable and soft. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the engine strain against some invisible resistance, and suddenly the fog parted like curtains, revealing the on-ramp back to the interstate. As my truck climbed the grade, I risked a look back at the truck plaza. For just a moment, I could see it clearly through the thinning mist, the neon signs, the other trucks, the building with its promise of warmth and human companionship. But everything remained perfectly still, locked in that eternal 2:47 a.m., like insects preserved in ancient amber. Wind buffeted the cab, the engine found its normal voice, and even the CB radio crackled back to life with the distant conversations of other drivers pushing through the night. I checked my fuel gauge and found it reading just as low as it had before I stopped, as if I had never pulled into Mel's 24-hour truck plaza at all. Miles passed beneath my wheels, and I told myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much coffee, the kind of experience that long-haul drivers sometimes report, but rarely discuss in detail. But when I stopped for fuel at a conventional truck stop outside of Grand Rapids, I asked the clerk about Mel's place back on 9. He looked at me with the kind of expression reserved for people who ask about things that don't exist, and told me there hadn't been a truck plaza at that exit for over 15 years. The old Mel's had burned down in a winter storm, he said, and they never rebuilt. Nothing there now but an empty lot, and some concrete foundations slowly being reclaimed by the Michigan wilderness. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself checking my dashboard clock obsessively, waiting to see if it will stick on a particular number and refuse to advance. The fog outside my window seems to move differently now, and I catch myself studying the faces of people in restaurants and gas stations, looking for that telltale stillness that might indicate I've slipped back into that space where time forgets how to flow. The 1,000-mile stare.
From Marcasite.
The interstate stretched ahead like a black tongue licking at the horizon, and I'd been driving this same route for 15 years, without ever questioning what I might find out there in the dark. My Peterbilt hummed its familiar lullaby, the diesel engine's rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, while the CB radio crackled with distant voices of other drivers sharing the loneliness of the night shift. Rain had started an hour back, light droplets that caught the glow of my headlights and danced across the windshield in hypnotic patterns. I'd always found comfort in night driving, the way the world narrowed down to just the cone of light ahead and the gentle sway of the cab as we rolled through the darkness. The load I was hauling wasn't anything special, just auto parts bound for Detroit, but the dispatcher had mentioned something odd when he'd handed me the paperwork. The previous driver, Tommy Kellerson, had called in sick at the last minute, said he couldn't finish the run. Tommy was one of those drivers who'd haul freight through a tornado if the money was right, so hearing he'd backed out of a job struck me as peculiar. Still, his loss was my gain, and I needed the miles to make my truck payment this month. Around midnight, somewhere between the flickering neon of a truck stop and the next exit that promised nothing but farmland and forgotten towns, I noticed the first one. At first glance, it looked like a raindrop, perfectly round and sitting right in my line of sight on the windshield. But raindrops don't have pupils, and they certainly don't blink. I hit the windshield wipers, expecting it to streak away with the other moisture, but it remained exactly where it was, as if it had been painted there with permanent ink. The wiper blade passed right over it without disturbing it in the slightest. The thing was definitely an eye, complete with what appeared to be brown iris and black pupil, about the size of a quarter and positioned just to the right of center on my windshield. The longer I stared at it, the more convinced I became that it was staring right back at me. A chill crept up my spine despite the warmth from the cab heater, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was some kind of decal, a prank left behind by the previous driver. Truckers were known for their practical jokes, and Tommy had always been a bit of a character. Or perhaps it was an optical illusion created by the interplay of rainwater and the lights from my dashboard, some trick of refraction that my tired eyes were misinterpreting. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, and fatigue could make anyone see things that weren't really there. But when I reached over to turn up the CB radio, hoping to hear another human voice to ground me in reality, I caught sight of a second eye. This one had appeared near the bottom left corner of the windshield, smaller than the first but unmistakably real. It had a different color iris, green instead of brown, and it seemed to be looking in a slightly different direction, as if tracking the movement of my hand toward the radio. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I forgot to exhale. The miles rolled by in a fog of disbelief and growing unease. Every few minutes I would glance up from the road to check if the eyes were still there, and each time they remained exactly as they had been, unblinking and unnaturally still. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the glass, but the sound seemed muffled now, as if the eyes were somehow absorbing the noise. I tried the windshield washers, hoping the spray of cleaning fluid might dissolve whatever substance was creating this bizarre hallucination, but the blue liquid simply ran around the eyes like water around stones in a stream. By the time I reached the next truck stop, a third eye had appeared near the top of the windshield, this one with a gray iris that seemed to shift and swirl like smoke. I pulled into the parking area, my hands shaking slightly as I set the air brakes and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive after hours of the diesel's constant rumble, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of rain against the roof. I sat there for several minutes, staring up at the three eyes that now adorned my windshield like some grotesque constellation. The truck stop was nearly empty, just a few other rigs scattered across the lot like sleeping giants. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to the front of my truck, expecting to see the eyes from the outside, to confirm that they were some kind of physical phenomenon rather than a product of my increasingly frayed nerves. But from this angle the windshield appeared completely normal, just curved glass, reflecting the yellow glow of the parking lot lights, and streaked with ordinary rainwater. I pressed my face close to the glass and peered through from the outside, trying to spot any trace of the eyes I'd been watching for the past 50 miles. Nothing. The windshield was clear and unremarkable, showing only the interior of my cab with its familiar dashboard and hanging air fresh. Yet when I climbed back into the driver's seat and looked out, all three eyes were still there, positioned exactly where they had been before, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The rest stop's fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across the wet pavement as I considered my options. I could call my dispatcher and report a medical emergency, claim I was having vision problems and needed to be relieved, but that would mean questions, possibly a mandatory medical evaluation, and I couldn't afford to lose my commercial license over what might turn out to be nothing more than stress-induced hallucination. I'd been in this business too long to risk my livelihood over something I couldn't even prove existed. Instead, I decided to push through. Detroit was still 6 hours away, but I'd driven through worse things than mysterious eyes on my windshield. I'd navigated blizzards that turned the interstate into an ice rink, thunderstorms that shook my truck like a child's toy, and fog so thick I couldn't see my own hood ornament. Surely I could handle a few optical illusions, regardless of how unsettling they might be. The engine rumbled back to life as I pulled out of the tick stop and merged back onto the interstate. The eyes remained exactly where they had been, but now they seemed more active somehow, more aware of my presence. I caught what I could have sworn was movement in my peripheral vision, the brown eye shifting to track something outside the passenger window, but each time I looked directly at them, they appeared as still as glass marbles. As the hours passed and the landscape rolled by in a blur of darkened farmland and distant lights, more eyes began to appear. They materialized slowly, one at a time, each one unique in color and size. Some were large enough that I could make out individual eyelashes, while others were so small they looked like distant stars. They covered the windshield in no apparent pattern, scattered across the glass like a handful of thrown dice, each one seemingly focused on something different yet somehow aware of my presence behind the wheel. The strangest part wasn't just their appearance, but the way they seemed to communicate with each other. I began to notice subtle movements, quick glances between eyes that suggested some kind of silent conversation was taking place right in front of me. The green eye would shift slightly to the left, and a moment later a blue eye near the center of the windshield would respond with its own minute movement. It was like watching a secret language being spoken in gestures too small for human eyes to properly detect. The rain had stopped sometime around 3 in the morning, but the eyes remained as clear and present as ever. By now there were at least 20 of them scattered across my field of vision, creating a bizarre mosaic that somehow didn't impair my ability to see the road ahead. It was as if they existed on a different plane of reality, visible to me but not interfering with the actual light passing through the glass. I found myself wondering if this was how Tommy Kellerson had felt, if this was why he'd abandoned the load and called in sick. As dawn approached and the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, I started to make out more details in the eyes that had been my companions through the night. Some had tiny blood vessels visible in the whites, others showed reflections of things I couldn't identify, images that seemed to come from places I'd never been. One eye near the rearview mirror appeared to be looking at a desert landscape, while another showed what looked like an underwater scene complete with floating kelp and schools of fish. The realization hit me gradually, like a slowly dawning understanding that changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. These weren't just random eyes appearing on my windshield. They were windows, portals through which other beings could observe our world, and I had somehow become their chosen vantage point.